Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I was running my cable route through the city, just another day on the job, weaving between blocks, dodging traffic, trying to make good time. It was one of those days where the heat clung to the pavement, radiating back up in waves, making the air thick and miserable. I had just wrapped up a job and was heading to my next appointment when it hit me, an urgent, gut-wrenching need to take a shit. Not the kind you can just brush off and deal with later. No, this was immediate, pressing, non-negotiable. I knew there was a quick trip a few miles away, but in city traffic, that might as well have been in another state. I didn't have that kind of time. I started scanning the streets, looking for anything, a gas station, a fast food place, a convenience store, anywhere with a restroom. My stomach twisted violently, a sharp pain shooting through my gut. I clenched my jaw, my foot pressing harder on the gas. There, on the corner, a rundown gas station with a flickering sign. It wasn't ideal, but beggars couldn't be choosers. I pulled in, parking haphazardly, barely shutting my door before making a beeline for the restroom. Of course, because fate has a sick sense of humor, there was already a line. One unisex bathroom, one door, 3 people waiting. A dude, a woman, and me. I nodded at them, trying to play it cool, but inside I was a wreck. My body was betraying me, my intestines twisting like a wrung-out towel. I started shifting my weight from foot to foot, mentally counting the seconds. The guy in front of me seemed normal enough. Well-dressed, clean-shaven, looked like he had his life together. The woman next to me was tapping away on her phone, looking like she regretted every choice that had led her to this exact moment. We made some small talk, just enough to pass the time, but my mind was elsewhere. Every second felt like an eternity. Then things went sideways. The guy in front of me suddenly snapped. No warning, no build-up. 1 second, he was normal. The next, he was full-blown feral. He lunged at the bathroom door, yanking on the handle with both hands, jerking it so hard the entire door frame rattled. He let out a guttural, animalistic scream, pure rage, panic, desperation. His whole body convulsed with the effort, his fingers clawing at the wood like he was trying to dig his way through it. The woman inside started screaming, her voice muffled by the door. The woman next to me gasped and took a step back. "What the fuck?" I started, stepping toward him, my gut still churning, but before I could even process what was happening, his body went rigid. It was like he had been struck by lightning. His muscles locked up, his eyes rolled back, and then he collapsed. Instinct kicked in, and I lunged forward, catching him just before he hit the ground. That's when I saw it. His eyes, wide open, were streaming tears of blood. Not a little bit. A full, steady trickle, staining his cheeks, mixing with the foam bubbling from his lips. His body convulsed violently, limbs jerking, back arching unnaturally. I was holding on to him, but he was barely there, his body thrashing against my grip. My brain struggled to keep up. 1 second, we were just 2 guys waiting for a damn bathroom, and now I was holding a man who looked like he was dying in my arms. The woman inside the bathroom yanked the door open, her face pale with horror. She was older, probably in her 60s, and the moment she saw what was happening, something in her shifted. "I'm a retired nurse," she said, already moving. "Lay him down carefully." I followed her instructions without hesitation. She knelt beside him, issuing orders to the gathering crowd. "Keep his head turned to the side. Someone call 911. Keep people back." The guy's body was still seizing, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The foam around his mouth had turned pink, a mixture of saliva and blood. My heart was hammering, the adrenaline flooding every inch of me, but I focused on keeping him stable. Minutes stretched out, each one feeling like an hour. The nurse kept checking his vitals, muttering reassurances even though he was beyond hearing them. The woman who had been standing in line with us looked like she was about to faint, her hands shaking as she gripped her phone. Sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me. The paramedics arrived fast, pushing through the crowd, taking over with swift, practiced movements. One of them knelt beside me, his voice calm but firm. "You did good, man. We got it from here." I stepped back, my hands shaking, watching as they worked on him. Oxygen mask for blood pressure cuff. The whole deal. He was stabilizing, his body finally still, his breathing less ragged. That's when his wife showed up. A woman in her 40s, hair tied back in a messy bun, her face lined with worry. She rushed over, her hands flying to her mouth as she took in the scene. One of the paramedics pulled her aside, speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't hear much, but I caught bits and pieces. Epileptic, alcoholism, seizures getting worse. It hit me then. The flask. I had seen him fidgeting with his coat pocket while we were waiting in line. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it made sense. He hadn't just been waiting to use the bathroom. He had been waiting for a chance to sneak a drink. And it had cost him. The paramedics loaded him onto the stretcher, securing the straps, getting ready to transport him. His wife followed, still shaken, but thanking everyone who had helped. And then, just like that, they were gone. The crowd started to disperse, murmuring among themselves, shaking their heads. The woman from earlier, the one who had been waiting in line with me, turned to me. "You still going in there?" I looked at the bathroom door. Still open, still just as dirty and unappealing as it had been before. The moment everything had gone to hell, my body had taken a back seat to the crisis. But now that it was over, the urgency came back with a vengeance. "Yeah," I said, stepping inside. I locked the door, sat down, and released the most long-awaited, deeply contemplated, life-changing shit of my existence. It was, without a doubt, the filthiest bathroom in the entire metro area, but I didn't care. I didn't care about anything except getting through that moment, letting everything go. When I walked out, the woman was still standing there, shaking her head. "You're braver than me," she said before walking away. I washed my hands, took one last look at the now empty gas station lot, and got back in my truck. I sat there for a long moment, replaying everything that had just happened. It was one of those moments that stuck with you, a reminder of how close chaos and normalcy lived next to each other, how quickly things could spiral into something you never expected. Then, with a deep breath, I put the truck in drive and headed to my next job. Because life didn't stop. Not for seizures, not for fear, not for anything. But damn if I wasn't going to remember that moment forever. When I was 18, my grandfather started having heart problems. It wasn't a surprise. He was getting older, and ever since my grandmother passed away 3 months earlier, he had been struggling. The house felt empty without her, and even though he never said much about it, I could tell he was lonely. I started visiting him every morning, just to keep him company. It became a routine. I'd wake up, drive over, and spend the day with him, talking, helping him around the house, watching TV. Sometimes we didn't do much of anything, but just being there seemed to make him feel better. I remember the way he moved slower than he used to. He had always been a strong man, the kind of person who never wanted help with anything. But now, even the smallest tasks seemed to take more effort. His breathing had changed too, a little more labored, a little more tired. He wasn't in pain, at least not that he told me, but he was weaker. He had doctor's appointments, checkups, but there was nothing they could do except tell him to rest and take his medication. He never really talked about it much, but I could see it in the way he looked at the world, like he was getting ready to say goodbye. It was June 7th, a day that is burned into my memory. I remember everything about it, the way the air smelled, the way the sunlight came through the windows in his house, the way he smiled when I walked in. That smile was the biggest one I had seen from him in months. It wasn't just happiness, it was something deeper, something peaceful. I felt relief seeing him like that. It was like for the first time in so long, he wasn't weighed down by grief or sickness. I thought maybe he was feeling better. I sat with him, just like always. We watched TV. I made him some breakfast. He moved slowly, but he still had that smile, like something had lifted off his shoulders. I remember him looking at me, still smiling, and saying something I didn't understand at the time. He said he was going to see his wife in 2 days. At first, I thought he was confused. Maybe his mind was starting to slip. Maybe he meant something else. But I didn't question it. I just nodded, let him talk, let him have his moment. There was no sadness in his voice, no fear. He sounded sure, like he knew something that I didn't. It didn't hit me at the time. I just brushed it off and spent the day with him like I always did. The next day, June 8th, was the same. He still had that smile, still had that peace about him. It felt strange. I didn't know why, but it made me uneasy. He wasn't acting any differently. He was just happy, calm, like he had let go of something. It didn't make sense. He wasn't supposed to be happy. He had been struggling so much, missing my grandmother, dealing with his failing health. But none of that seemed to matter to him anymore. He just sat in his chair, watching the world, like he was taking it all in one last time. I stayed with him longer than usual that day. Something told me to. I didn't even realize it at the time, but I didn't want to leave. When I finally did, he gave me that same smile and told me to take care of myself. Those were the last words I ever heard from him. The morning of June 9th, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest. I couldn't explain it. I didn't have any reason to feel that way, but something was off. I got ready like normal, but everything felt slower. Even driving to his house felt different, like I was moving through thick air. I pulled into the driveway, and before I even got out of the car, I knew. I don't know how. Maybe it was the stillness of the house, the way the curtains weren't moving in the breeze. Maybe it was just a feeling, but I knew. I let myself in like always. The house was quiet, too quiet. I called out for him, but there was no answer. The TV wasn't on. The kitchen was exactly how we had left it the night before. I walked through the house, feeling that heavy weight pressing down on me with every step. And then I saw him. He was in his bed, lying on his back, hands resting on his stomach, just like he had gone to sleep. There was no sign of struggle, no pain on his face. He looked peaceful, just like he had the past 2 days. I don't remember how long I stood there. Everything in my body felt numb. It didn't seem real. He had known. He had told me. He said he was going to see my grandmother in 2 days, and now he was gone. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't some random thing. He knew. Somehow he knew. The next few days were a blur. Calling family, the funeral, all of it. But the thing that stuck with me the most was that last smile. That peace. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't fighting it. He was ready. And somehow, that made it even scarier. Because it meant there was something about dying that we don't understand. Something that he knew, but I didn't. Something I still don't. Even now, all these years later, I still think about it. I can still see the way he looked at me that day, the way he smiled. I still hear his voice saying those words. I don't know what he saw, what he felt, but I know he wasn't afraid. And maybe that's what unsettles me the most. Not the fact that he knew he was going to die, but the fact that he seemed to welcome it. I don't know if I'll ever understand. Maybe one day, when my time comes, I'll feel it too. Maybe I'll know, just like he did. But until then, I'll always wonder. Because whatever it was something bigger than me. Bigger than all of us. I moved into the apartment in Oslo with 2 other girls. The building was old, mid-1800s, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in only a sliver of natural light, even on the brightest days. The walls were thick, the floors wooden, warped in places from years of settling. It had character, the kind people romanticize when they talk about European apartments. But from the first day, something about it felt off. It wasn't immediate, just a subtle discomfort, like walking into a room and forgetting why you went in there. A vague unease that you couldn't quite put your finger on. The other 2 didn't seem to notice anything, so I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the age of the place, the drafty hallways, or the way the light never quite reached the corners of the rooms. Maybe it was just in my head. But there was one room I avoided completely. It had been a small bedroom at some point, though we didn't use it for much. Just storage, mostly, a place to put things we didn't have a use for. The temperature in that room was always different from the rest of the apartment, colder even when the radiators were on full blast. The air inside felt dense, heavy in a way that made my chest tight when I stood in the doorway. I tried to convince myself it was just a draft, just bad insulation, but every time I went in, I felt like I was intruding. Not just in an old, empty room, something more than that. I never told the others. It felt stupid, childish. But I never stayed in there longer than I had to. There were other things, small at first. Doors that wouldn't stay shut, even when latched properly. A bathroom light that flickered just enough to be irritating. The cat. One of my roommates had a young cat, just over a year old. It would sometimes stare at the walls, fixated on nothing, ears twitching as if it was hearing something I couldn't. I knew cats did that sometimes, that they were strange creatures, but there was something different about it. Sometimes it would stare into that cold room, its tail flicking back and forth, tense, refusing to enter. Then there was the night I woke up to something growling in my room. I had taken the old living room as my bedroom. It was bigger than the others, and it had a large, worn-out fireplace that had long since been sealed off. The walls were lined with bookshelves, remnants from past tenants. The place was warm, comfortable, even if the floor creaked underfoot, no matter how carefully I walked. That night, I woke up with my heart hammering in my chest. I don't remember the dream I had, if I had one at all, but I woke to a deep, guttural growl. Not a dog's growl, something bigger, heavier. A thick, rolling snarl, low and threatening. My whole body went rigid before I could even process what was happening. I tried to sit up, to turn my head, but I couldn't move. It was like something was pressing down on me, pinning me to the bed. My chest tightened, my breathing shallow and frantic. The growling didn't stop. It was close, so close I should have been able to feel breath on my skin, but there was nothing there. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe seconds, maybe minutes. It felt endless. Then suddenly it was gone. I sucked in a breath and bolted upright, the weight on my chest vanishing. My room was silent. Nothing in the dark, nothing at all. I sat there for a long time, heart pounding, staring into the corners of my room, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. I told myself it was sleep paralysis. I had heard of it before, read about it. That's all it was, some trick of the mind. But it didn't feel like that. The sound had been real, the weight had been real. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The worst thing that happened was the cat. We were just sitting around, nothing out of the ordinary, when we heard it. A horrible, wheezing sound coming from the bathroom. We rushed in, and there it was, on the floor, tongue out, gasping for air, its small body convulsing. The sound it made was unlike anything I had ever heard from an animal. It wasn't just distress, it was agony. We panicked, tried to figure out what was happening, but there was nothing we could do. It didn't take long. 10 minutes, maybe. And then it just stopped. Just like that. I couldn't stay in that place much longer after that. The apartment didn't feel like a home. Didn't even feel like a place meant to be lived in. I don't believe in ghosts, never have, but something about that place was wrong. The kind of wrong you can't explain, just feel in your gut. I packed up and left as soon as I could. The others stayed. They didn't seem as affected, or at least they never talked about it if they were. I never told them how I felt about that room, about the things I'd heard. I didn't want to sound crazy. Months later, after I had moved into a new place, I saw one of them at a coffee shop. We talked for a bit, catching up on small things. Then she mentioned, offhandedly, that they had found old papers stuffed inside the walls when they had finally moved out. Some kind of records from a long time ago, from when the building had been a boarding house. She told me that at some point, in the late 1800s, it had also been an orphanage. Not a well-run one either. She laughed, like it was an interesting piece of history, like it was something we could joke about. I didn't laugh. I didn't say anything at all. I've been waiting for a while to post this story, and I hope whoever reads it enjoys it and gets as creeped out as I did. I just want to say that I've never been the type to believe in ghosts or paranormal activity. Even as a kid, I never took ghost stories seriously. I always thought there had to be a logical explanation for anything strange. But what happened to me a few years ago made me question everything. My mom was in the real estate business, which meant she often had to visit houses before showing them to clients. She usually did this alone, but every once in a while, she would take me along. One day, a house came on the market that had a bit of a reputation. Other real estate agents had mentioned that it was haunted. My mom wasn't the superstitious type, so she didn't think much of it. She figured she'd take me along to check it out. I didn't care either way. It was just another house to me. When we pulled up, the first thing I noticed was how overgrown everything was. Vines covered nearly the entire exterior, twisting around the windows and creeping up toward the roof. The yard was a mess, grass up to my knees, weeds growing in patches, and what used to be a garden now completely overtaken by wild plants. The house itself was old, probably early 1900s, with a sagging porch and paint peeling off in large strips. It looked abandoned, though I knew it had been lived in recently. Inside, the house had that distinct smell of a place that had been empty for a while. A mix of stale air, old wood, and something slightly musty. It wasn't falling apart or anything, but it had that eerie stillness you only find in empty houses. The furniture was still there, like the owners had just left one day and never came back. The first thing that struck me as odd was an old box-style television sitting in the corner of the living room. It was on, playing a black and white documentary about World War II. The screen flickered slightly, and the grainy footage made the whole scene feel like something out of a different time. The house wasn't supposed to have electricity running, so I figured maybe it was plugged into a generator or something. My mom didn't seem to notice, so I didn't say anything. We walked through the first floor, checking out the kitchen, dining room, and a small sitting area near the back. Everything looked normal, just old and abandoned. Then we went upstairs. The second floor had a long hallway with 3 rooms staggered along its length. The first room we checked out was nothing special, just an empty bedroom with a faded floral wallpaper and a dusty old bed frame left behind. The second room, though, was different. The moment we stepped in, I felt a strange heaviness. The entire room was filled with taxidermy animals. Deer heads mounted on the walls, a bear standing in the corner, birds perched on wooden plaques, a fox sitting on a shelf, glass eyes staring blankly into the distance. It wasn't just a few, it was packed. I counted at least a dozen different animals in that room. The air smelled different here, not quite rotten, but not fresh either. Something about the room felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. My mom didn't seem bothered, so we moved on to the last bedroom, which was normal, plain empty, nothing unusual. As we walked back down the hallway, I glanced back at the taxidermy room. Something made me stop in my tracks. In the center of the room, where there had been nothing before, was now a chair. A simple wooden chair, sitting directly in the middle of the floor. I knew for a fact it hadn't been there when we walked in. If it had been, we would have noticed it. We would have had to walk around it. I just stood there, staring. My mom stopped a few steps ahead when she noticed I wasn't following. She looked back into the room, and I saw the confusion on her face. She noticed it too. Neither of us said anything. We just turned and walked quickly down the stairs, out the front door, and back to the car. We didn't speak until we were halfway home. "Did you see that chair before?" my mom finally asked. I shook my head. No, that was the end of it. We didn't talk about it again. She never mentioned the house after that, and I never asked. But the image of that chair sitting perfectly centered in that room stayed with me. There was no explanation. We had been the only two in the house. We had stayed together the entire time. The doors had been locked when we got there, and they were still locked when we left. A few years later, I looked up the house out of curiosity. It had been sold 5 or 6 times in a short span, and nearly every owner had complained about strange occurrences. Things moving on their own, objects not being where they were left, doors opening and closing by themselves. I don't know what was going on in that house. I don't have an explanation. But even now, years later, I still think about that chair. And I still can't explain how it got there. When I started college, everything felt like a blur. Between classes, studying, and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, I barely had time to think. But that changed when my grandmother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. The news hit my family hard, and without hesitation, I moved in with my grandparents to help take care of her. She had always been a strong woman, the kind who took care of everyone else. Seeing her in that condition was difficult. The doctors gave her 2 months to live, but she held on for 9. During that time, my days revolved around helping her in whatever way I could. I'd cook for her, help her to the bathroom, and sit with her for hours when she was too weak to move. My grandfather did his best, but I could see the exhaustion on his face. He was watching the woman he had spent his whole life with fade away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The house changed during those 9 months. It was always quiet, but not in the peaceful way it had been before. It was a heavy silence, the kind that pressed down on you. Some nights, I'd wake up and just listen. The house would settle, creak in places it never used to, and I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning. When she finally passed, it was a relief in some ways. She wasn't suffering anymore, and neither was my grandfather. The funeral was small. Family, a few friends, people she had known for decades. After it was over, my grandfather asked me to stay for a while longer, just to keep him company. I agreed. The first time I saw her was about 2 weeks after she died. It wasn't anything dramatic. I was alone in the house, standing in the kitchen, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone walking down the hallway. I turned my head, expecting to see my grandfather, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I told myself I was just tired, that I had been on edge for too long, and my brain was playing tricks on me. But then it happened again, and again. I'd be sitting in the living room, reading, and I'd catch a glimpse of movement. Or I'd be in the computer room, focused on the screen, and I'd feel something behind me, just the faintest pressure, like someone was sitting on the bed. None of it scared me. It should have, but it didn't. If anything, it felt normal, like she was still there, just going about her routine. It wasn't until I mentioned it to my grandfather that I started to second-guess myself. He didn't react much, just nodded and said, "She spent her whole life in this house." That was all he said. Nothing more. One night, a girl I had been seeing stopped by. We didn't date for long, but at the time, we were spending a lot of time together. That night, we were in the laundry room, which was right next to the garage. I had stepped out to grab something, and when I came back in, we hugged for a moment. That's when we heard it. The sound of a dog running through the house. It was distinct, the quick tapping of nails on the tile floor, the heavy but controlled pace of something moving fast. It was coming straight toward us. I barely had time to react before we saw it. A dog, a medium-sized mutt with thick fur, rounded the corner and ran directly between our legs. But instead of stopping, it went straight through the closed door into the garage. We stood there, frozen. I turned to her, and she looked at me with wide eyes, her mouth slightly open, but neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. We had both seen it, heard it, felt it. The only problem was, there hadn't been a dog in that house for years. My grandparents had a dog when I was a toddler, a dog I barely remembered outside of pictures. It had died when I was 2. We left the house immediately that night. I didn't talk about it with her, and we never brought it up again. But I knew what I had seen, what we had both seen. I stayed with my grandfather for a few more months before eventually moving back to campus. Life moved on. My grandfather sold the house a couple of years later, and it passed to another family. I don't know what happened after that. Maybe the new owners never noticed anything, or maybe they did and ignored it. Even now, I don't have an explanation for what happened. I don't believe in ghosts, at least not in the way people talk about them. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Some things don't leave a place, even when they're gone. It was a clear night, the kind that made the ground glow in the moonlight. We had been dropped off hours earlier, making our way through the hills and sparse tree lines, moving swiftly but carefully. The terrain wasn't difficult, and the moon made it easy to navigate, though it also meant we had to be extra cautious about being seen. 7 of us were out that night, 4 seasoned guys and 3 newer ones, making it a good chance to give them a real test while still ensuring we got our job done. The first 10 kilometers passed without much concern. We moved efficiently, covering ground, checking the usual paths, and watching for any sign of weapons movement. Nothing. A quiet night, which in itself was both a relief and a frustration. If nothing was moving, it meant we might be wasting time. If something was moving and we weren't seeing it, that meant we were already behind. As we regrouped for a check-in, I took my usual role as rear security. Elle was just ahead of me, keeping his own eyes on our backs while the rest of the team continued forward. It was a habit for us to work together like this. He covered me, I covered him. We were the last to move every time we took off again, making sure nothing followed and nothing was left behind. That was when I heard it, a shift in the trees, about 50 meters back. Subtle, but distinct enough that it didn't blend in with the usual sounds of the night. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Elle turned his head slightly, confirming we both caught it. The rest of the team didn't react. They were moving forward, focused on the mission. I whispered to Elle, letting him know I'd stay back while he caught up to the others. I crouched low, listening. The trees swayed, but there was no wind. The air was still. I watched carefully, breathing slow, waiting for something, anything, to move again. 2 minutes passed. The longest 2 minutes of my life. The forest remained silent. Then, just as Elle and the others started circling back toward me, something moved. Only 15 meters ahead, a shift in the darkness. The kind that stood out when you'd spent enough time looking at landscapes that should remain still. Elle and the team took up a wide formation, moving in carefully, ready for anything. I moved forward, rifle steady, ready to confirm whatever was hiding in the brush. Nothing. No tracks. No sign of movement. No indication that anything had been there at all. The guys gave Elle and me a hard time about it, laughing as we regrouped and continued toward the extraction point. I let them laugh. I wasn't sure what I'd seen, but I knew something had been there. I just couldn't prove it. We moved on. 2 more kilometers through open ground before we reached an orchard. The trees were spaced out, their branches stretching wide in the moonlight. The terrain made it easier to see, which meant we could move quickly. I stayed back again, watching as Elle took his position ahead. Then I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just movement. A sound, light but distinct. A giggle. Soft, distant, almost playful. I froze. My mind immediately tried to rationalize it. Some kind of animal, a trick of the wind, maybe even one of the new guys messing around. But nothing about it made sense. It was a child's giggle. Elle had moved ahead again, so I followed, keeping close to the trees as I moved. As I reached one of them, something caught my eye. The bark had a pattern, knots and ridges forming what looked like a face. It wasn't unusual. People saw faces in trees all the time. But this one turned. A small face, pale and round, emerged from the knots, smiling at me. A child's face. A small hand lifted, fingers wiggling in a slow wave. A giggle, soft, clear, unmistakable, before it faded back into the tree. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to process what had just happened, to find a logical explanation. But there was none. I ran. I caught up to Elle, said nothing, and kept moving. I didn't need anyone questioning me, and I wasn't about to let myself start questioning my own sanity. We reached the extraction point without issue. By the time we were in the air, leaving the ground behind, I had convinced myself it was nothing. A trick of the eyes, exhaustion, stress. Whatever it was, I would not dwell on it. 2 weeks later, I was assigned to a different task. I wasn't going back to that area. The engineers needed security while they worked through a minefield near a village, and I was happy to take the job. It was straightforward, and more importantly, it kept me far from the orchard. When I returned to the barracks, the guys were already there, laughing about something. Elle wasn't. He sat on his bunk, ignoring them, rubbing a hand over his face. One of the others saw me and called out, grinning. Elle doesn't want to patrol your favorite spot anymore. I didn't respond. I just looked at Elle. He looked at me. Days later, we were sent out on another run, watching over some scouts as they worked through an area. We didn't talk much. Then, while the others were busy, Elle finally broke the silence. What did you see? I shook my head. Nothing. Just my mind playing tricks. He didn't buy it. I know you saw her. I saw her too. I felt cold. My stomach tightened, a deep, twisting sensation I couldn't shake. He had no reason to say that. No reason to assume I had seen anything, let alone the same thing. But he had. I didn't respond. I didn't want to know any more than I already did. He exhaled, shaking his head. I saw her inside a tree. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. Because whatever he had seen, it had been real enough to make him refuse to go back there. And that was all I needed to know. We never spoke about it again, and we never returned to that orchard. I pulled into the driveway just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the neighborhood. The familiar sight of my parents' house brought a sense of comfort, as it always did, but something felt off almost immediately. The curtains were drawn, and the porch light wasn't on. That was strange. My mom always turned it on before dark, especially if she knew I'd be coming home late. I stepped out of the car, slamming the door shut behind me, and walked up to the front door. It was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside, calling out, "Hello." Silence. I frowned. My parents were supposed to be home. My dad had mentioned something about working in the yard, and my mom was going to spend the day baking. Yet the house was eerily still. No television playing in the background, no clatter from the kitchen, no murmurs of conversation. I hesitated in the entryway for a moment, listening. Nothing. A heavy feeling settled in my stomach. I dropped my bag by the door and walked through the hallway, peeking into the living room. The couches were undisturbed, the coffee table cluttered with the usual magazines and remote controls. Nothing seemed out of place, but the quiet was suffocating. I moved on to the bedrooms. My parents' bed was neatly made, the way my mom always kept it. The master bathroom door was open, revealing an empty room. I checked my own bedroom next, but nothing was unusual there either. I was beginning to feel stupid. Maybe they had stepped out for a quick errand. But then why had they left the door unlocked? Still unsettled, I headed toward the kitchen. Maybe they had left a note. My mom usually scribbled messages and stuck them to the fridge whenever she went somewhere. As soon as I stepped into the kitchen, I froze. Blood. Everywhere. The sink was stained deep red, streaks running down the basin and pooling at the bottom. The countertops were splattered with it, droplets scattered across the white tiles like something had been violently thrown or cut. The floor had dark smears, as if someone had walked through it, dragging it along. My breath hitched. My entire body went cold. What the hell happened? My chest tightened. My hands trembled as I took another step inside. The smell hit me then, metallic, thick, unmistakable. It made my stomach turn. I reached for the house phone on the wall, my first instinct to call for help. But when I grabbed it, my fingers slipped. More blood. The receiver was slick with it. The buttons were smeared, as if someone had tried to use it with blood-soaked hands. I jerked my hand back, my breath coming faster now. My eyes darted around the kitchen, searching for any sign of my parents. That's when I saw the blood trail. It led from the sink, down the side of the counter, pooling onto the floor, and continuing toward the door leading to the basement and the garage. Something in me snapped. Whoever had done this could still be in the house. My skin prickled with fear. Every instinct screamed at me to get out. I didn't wait to think. I turned and bolted, nearly tripping over my own feet as I sprinted toward the front door. I threw it open, bursting outside, my voice raw as I screamed for help. Before I could even process what was happening, a police car pulled into the driveway. Right behind it was my mom's car. I barely had time to register the flashing lights before my mom jumped out of the car, her hands, her clothes, everything covered in blood. My stomach lurched. But before I could even form a question, she shouted frantically, "We have to find Dad's finger." The world seemed to tilt. My brain struggled to catch up. I blinked at her. My dad's finger? The police officers were already getting out of their car, hurrying toward my mother, who was gesturing wildly toward the backyard. It took several seconds for me to process what was happening. My father had been working in the yard, the wood chipper. I felt my knees go weak as realization dawned. The blood in the kitchen, the smeared phone, the trail leading to the basement. It wasn't a crime scene. It was an accident. I followed them in a daze as they rushed to the backyard. The massive pile of wood chips sat undisturbed, except for the crimson stains splattered along the machine. My dad was nowhere in sight, already taken to the hospital, I assumed. My mom and the officers immediately began searching, sifting through the pile, looking for the missing finger. But it was nowhere to be found. Hours later, when things had calmed down and my mom returned from the hospital with news that Dad was stable, though permanently missing a digit, I was given the task of putting the wood chipper away. I didn't want to do it. The sight of that machine made my skin crawl. But I had no choice. I moved the pile first, using the shovel to spread it out, shaking off the damp, heavy feeling of the blood-stained wood chips. And then I saw it. The finger. It was pale, unnervingly lifeless, lying there like some discarded piece of plastic. It didn't even look real. More like a prop from a horror movie. I couldn't bring myself to touch it with my bare hands. Using 2 sticks, I carefully lifted it and carried it inside, my stomach twisting the entire time. When I showed it to my dad, he stared at it for a long time. And then, to my shock, he started to cry. Silent, shaking sobs that made my chest tighten. We buried it in the backyard later that evening, right next to our old dog. I never looked at that spot the same way again. When I was a child, I shared a room with my younger sister. Our beds were set against opposite walls, with a window on one side of the room and the door leading to the hallway on the other. We had a small nightstand between us with a lamp on it, but I also had a light switch right next to my bed. At night, we would whisper to each other before falling asleep, sometimes laughing at silly jokes or talking about things that had happened during the day. One night, I was lying in bed, half asleep, when my sister spoke up. Her voice was quiet but firm, not playful like it usually was. She told me to look at the door. I turned my head, and in the dim light from the hallway, I saw it. There was a man standing in the doorway, or at least the dark outline of one. He wasn't moving, just standing there. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The figure was tall, taller than my dad, and completely still. No sound, no breathing, nothing. The switch was right next to my bed, so without thinking, I reached over and flicked it on. The room flooded with light. The doorway was empty. My sister and I stared at the empty space for a long time, my hand still resting on the switch. My stomach was in knots. I didn't want to turn the light off again. Neither of us spoke for a while, but eventually we called for our dad. He came in, looking tired and confused, and asked what was wrong. We told him what we had seen. He sighed, rubbing his eyes, and told us it was probably just our eyes playing tricks on us. Shadows from the hallway, maybe. He turned the light off and told us to go back to sleep. We did eventually, but I lay awake for what felt like hours, staring at that empty doorway, trying to convince myself that he was right. The next morning, I went downstairs and found my dad sitting at the kitchen table. He wasn't drinking coffee or reading the newspaper like he usually did. He was just sitting there, staring at nothing. I asked him what was wrong. He didn't look at me right away. When he finally did, he asked, "Was the man you saw a tall man?" Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. That was the first time I saw him, but it wasn't the last. Over the years, it happened again. Sometimes my sister would see him. Sometimes it was me. A few times my mom or dad saw him too. But it was always the same. A tall figure standing in the doorway, completely still, watching. And every time, as soon as a light came on, he was gone. We never found an explanation. My parents tried everything. They checked the locks on the doors and windows, made sure nothing was casting weird shadows. We even rearranged the furniture once, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. It kept happening. Months would go by without anything, and then suddenly, he would be there again. One night, I woke up and saw him standing in the hallway outside my parents' room. I wasn't even scared anymore, just exhausted. I turned on the lamp next to me. Gone. I sat there for a long time, listening to the house settle, feeling my skin prickle. I thought about waking my parents, but what was the point? They had seen him too. We all had. As I got older, it happened less and less. By the time I moved out for college, I hadn't seen him in a few years. My parents still lived in the same house, and when I visited, I never asked if they still saw him. I didn't want to know. But one night, while I was home for a holiday, I woke up suddenly. I don't know why. There was no sound, nothing out of place. But I had that same feeling I used to get. That cold, heavy awareness that something was there. I didn't turn my head toward the door. I didn't want to see if he was there. I just lay still, staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning. The next day, I didn't mention it to anyone. My parents seemed normal. My sister, who had also come home for the holidays, acted like nothing had happened. But later, when we were alone in the kitchen, she asked, "Did you wake up last night?" I looked at her. She wasn't smiling. I nodded. She hesitated, then said, "Me too." That was the last time we talked about it. I don't know if my parents ever saw him again after we left. I never asked. But sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, in my own home, far away from that house, I still feel it. That heavy awareness. That cold, pressing silence. And I keep my eyes shut. I woke up to the red glow of my alarm clock. 10:21. The numbers burned into my half-asleep mind as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, willing myself to get up. It was a day off, and I had no obligations, but my body was too used to routine to sleep any longer. The warmth of my blankets made it tempting to stay in bed, but eventually, I threw them off and sat up. The room was dim, the blinds drawn tight, but sunlight pushed in through the edges, casting thin golden lines on the floor. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, rubbed my face, and finally forced myself to stand. My usual morning sluggishness followed me to the bathroom, where I relieved myself, washed my hands, and brushed my teeth. The warm air inside the bathroom was comforting, and I took my time washing up. I stood there for a moment, eyes half-lidded, staring at myself in the mirror, feeling the grogginess slowly fade. I got dressed lazily, grabbing whatever clothes were closest. There was no rush. Once I was finally ready to go downstairs, I stepped back into my room and instinctively grabbed my phone. The moment my eyes landed on the screen, I felt a sharp jolt of confusion. 10:25. That wasn't right. I frowned, my thumb hovering over the screen as if I had simply misread it. There was no way I had done all that in 4 minutes. I had taken my time in the bathroom, I had brushed my teeth, I had spent a few minutes just standing there, and dressing was never a quick task for me. Maybe I was just groggier than I realized when I first woke up. Maybe I misread the clock. To make sure, I turned to my alarm clock, the same one I had looked at when I first woke up. 10:25, that felt off. But I told myself I must have been mistaken earlier. Shaking my head, I stuffed my phone into my pocket and walked downstairs. The house was quiet. The sun was bright now, flooding through the blinds and highlighting dust in the air. I moved through the usual motions of my morning, turned on my computer, flicked on the TV for some background noise, and went into the kitchen to make breakfast. I had leftover rice in the fridge, and I figured I'd reheat it while I cooked some eggs. I opened the microwave, put the rice inside, and instinctively glanced at the clock on it as I pressed the buttons. 10:25. I stopped. My hands hovered over the buttons as my stomach twisted uncomfortably. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and checked. 10:25. I turned my head slightly, catching the reflection of the stove clock. 10:25. That was impossible. I wasn't half asleep anymore. I had gone downstairs, turned on my computer, turned on the TV, gotten myself a glass of water, and started making breakfast. I knew for a fact that it had taken more than a single minute. I put my phone down on the counter and stood there, staring at the microwave clock, feeling unease creep up my spine. I decided to test it. If something was wrong, I needed to see it happen. I started counting in my head, keeping my eyes fixed on the glowing green numbers. If it stayed on 10:25 for a full 60 seconds, something was definitely broken. I counted. At about 20 seconds, the clock flicked to 10:26. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with lingering doubt. Maybe I had just caught the tail end of 10:25. Maybe the clocks were fine, and I was just overthinking things. I continued making breakfast, trying to push the unease away. I finished cooking, plated my food, and carried it over to my desk. I sat down, my computer humming softly as it booted up, the soft drone of the news playing from the TV behind me. As I reached for my keyboard, my eyes caught the time displayed on my monitor. 10:20. My hand froze above the mouse. I yanked my phone out of my pocket. 10:20. My stomach twisted so hard I thought I might be sick. That was impossible. Just minutes ago, I had been in the kitchen staring at 10:26 on the microwave. I had counted the seconds myself. I had watched time move. I clicked on the clock in the corner of my screen and pulled up the time settings. I stared at the second hand as it ticked forward, watching the numbers change normally. I let a minute pass. Then two. Everything moved as it should. I sat back in my chair, heart hammering. Maybe my phone had bugged out. Maybe my computer had reset for some reason. I opened a browser and searched for an online clock. The web page loaded. 10:20. That was when I started writing everything down. I opened a notepad file and began typing furiously, trying to track the time jumps, trying to make sense of what was happening. Over the next hour, at least what I thought was an hour, I kept an eye on the clocks. When I watched them, they worked fine. When I looked away for more than a couple of minutes, they changed unpredictably. At one point, my phone read 10:14. A few minutes later, 10:13. Then it jumped back into the 10:20s. The shifts weren't consistent. They didn't make sense. I tried restarting my phone, rebooting my PC, even unplugging the microwave for a few seconds before plugging it back in. Nothing changed. The moment I looked away for too long, the time scrambled again. I sat there, watching, waiting, wondering if I was losing my mind. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I checked my phone. The time was normal. I checked the PC. It matched. The microwave, the TV, the stove. Everything was back to normal. The clocks never glitched again. It was as if it had never happened. For years, I thought about that morning, about how the numbers refused to make sense. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe there was some bizarre technical issue that resolved itself. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I had been awake. I had watched time move correctly, and I had watched it break. And the strangest thing? To this day, when I randomly wake up and check the time, I still feel uneasy when I see 10:21. When you're young, broke, and in love, there's a kind of blind optimism that carries you through life's struggles. My boyfriend and I were no different. We were both poor, but not so poor that we couldn't afford a small apartment in a college town. It wasn't much, just a tiny one-bedroom unit on the first floor of an old building. The walls were thick with decades of paint, the appliances belonged in a museum, and the bathroom didn't have a vent, just a window in the shower. But it was ours, and that was enough. Because of our opposite work schedules, him working graveyard shifts, me working days, we spent a lot of time apart. When we were together, we appreciated the little things. A lot of naked time, a lot of lazy mornings, a lot of laughing. And for a while, things were good. He had this habit of sneaking up to the bathroom window while I was showering, trying to catch a glimpse. It became a game. I always caught him, and we'd laugh about it. It never felt like anything more than harmless fun. At some point, I started noticing a log outside the window. It was always standing upright, right in the perfect spot where someone could stand on it and see inside. I assumed it was him, but every time I asked, he denied it. He'd move it away when I pointed it out, but within a few days, it would be back. I chalked it up to the maintenance workers moving things around, not thinking much of it. And when winter came, and the workers cleared everything away, I forgot about it entirely. When our lease was up, the complex offered a deal. We could move into a bigger 2-bedroom unit for even less rent. We jumped at the chance. The new apartment, though, was in a completely different part of the complex. Our old unit had faced a quiet suburban street. The new one backed up to an alley behind a strip mall, with dumpsters and stray cats picking through trash. It was darker, quieter, and somehow just a little more isolated. None of that mattered at first. We were thrilled with the extra space. Life went on. Then, on Valentine's Day, my boyfriend bought me an engagement ring. It was beautiful, but there was a mistake. Someone had mixed up the size. I wore a 4, but the ring was a 12. He put it in the glove box of his car to return it the next day. But overnight, someone broke in. The only thing they took was the ring. We checked every pawn shop in the area, but no one claimed to have seen it. I never got another one. Spring came and went. Then summer. The city started making budget cuts. Police stations in our area closed. Our neighborhood, which had already felt a little rough around the edges, started to feel worse. We lost our phone service because we couldn't afford the bill. It didn't matter much. We only really talked to each other anyway. The days were long, and the dangers of the neighborhood felt distant when the sun was out. One night, my boyfriend went to bed early, and I decided to take a bath. I ran the water, added bubbles, opened the window for the summer air. I stripped, dropping my clothes in a pile on the floor, and grabbed my laptop to watch a movie while I soaked. The warm water, the dim light from the screen, the sound of the film, it was perfect. One movie turned into 2. Hours passed without me realizing. Finally, I pulled the plug and sat there as the water drained. The night air from the open window felt cool against my face. I stood, stretching, grabbing my towel. I didn't even think about the window. The screen was the only thing between me and the outside. I stepped around my pile of clothes, moving toward the door, when something caught my eye. There was a man outside the window. At first, my brain didn't register what I was seeing. I thought it was my boyfriend playing a prank. But then I saw his eyes, too high in the window. My stomach dropped. My mind swam. He was standing on something high enough that his entire torso was visible. My brain tried to make sense of it, tried to rationalize it, until I saw the movement of his hand. He was touching himself. I was frozen, naked, completely exposed. My eyes followed the motion of his hand. Then I saw it, the silver ring with Celtic knotwork. My engagement ring, the one stolen months ago. It was on his finger. I don't remember moving. I don't remember making a sound. One moment I was in the bathroom, the next I was in the bedroom, shaking, yanking the covers around me. My boyfriend woke up to me gasping out broken words. There's a man, outside bathroom window. By the time he got up to check, there was nothing. Just an empty alley. Just the night. Just the same upright log, standing exactly where it had been before. We filed a police report. It took us 20 minutes to even find a working station. They couldn't do much. We couldn't afford to break our lease. So we stayed. We lived in fear. I covered every window with black paper. I jammed boards into the frames so they couldn't open. The bathroom window never opened again. I carried pepper spray every time I stepped outside. I never went anywhere alone after dark. But some nights, I'd hear something outside the bedroom window. Soft sounds, footsteps in the dirt. And in the morning, my boyfriend would check. There would always be footprints in the ground, pressed deep where someone had stood for a long time, just watching. We lived like that for another year. Even after we moved, I never stopped feeling watched. I never stopped checking my windows. And I never saw my engagement ring again. The house had a quietness to it, the kind that presses against your ears and makes even the smallest sounds feel too loud. It was late in the evening, the air heavy with the kind of warmth that comes before a storm, but with no breeze, no movement. Just stillness. My dad and my auntie sat in the front waiting room of my grandparents' house, the space just outside my great-grandfather's bedroom where he lay on his deathbed. The house felt different that night, like it was holding its breath. The waiting room was simple, with 3 doors leading in and out. One opened into my grandparents' bedroom, the other led to the rest of the house, and the last one, a sturdy wooden door, opened out to the front garden. It was one of those old wooden doors that fit so snugly into the frame that you had to put some strength into closing it properly. The lock clicked in a way that let you know it was secure. It never moved on its own, never creaked unless pushed. They sat in silence, listening to the muffled voices coming from the bedroom. The air inside the house had taken on that weight that comes when someone is close to passing, a mix of sorrow, exhaustion, and anticipation. No one said it, but they were waiting for that moment. My auntie shivered and rubbed her arms. Even though the house was warm, she felt a sudden chill. It wasn't normal. There were no windows open, no drafts. Just a sharp, biting cold. Without thinking much about it, she got up and walked to the wooden door. It had been slightly ajar, just a crack, as it usually was when people came and went from the house. She placed her hand on the cool wood, pushed it fully closed, and twisted the lock. Satisfied, she returned to her seat. The room settled back into silence. Minutes passed. Nothing changed, but there was an odd tension in the air, the kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up even though you can't explain why. Then, from the bedroom, my grandmother let out a sound, long, drawn out, breaking with grief. It was the sound of finality, the sound of something ending. At that exact moment, the locked wooden door exploded open. Not inward, as if someone had forced their way in, but outward, as if someone inside the house had slammed it in anger, storming out into the night. It banged against the wall outside with such force that the echo rang through the silent house, vibrating through the floorboards, sending a sharp jolt through my dad and auntie where they sat. And just as violently as it had flung open, it swung back, slamming shut with a deep, resonant thud that rattled the windows. They both froze. It had been locked. Not just closed, but locked. There was no wind, no draft, no explanation for how a door like that, solid, heavy, stubborn in its frame, could have moved like that. It had felt intentional, forceful, like someone leaving in a fit of rage. But there was no one there. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The house was completely still again, except for the muffled sound of my grandmother crying in the next room. The moment stretched out, thick with something they couldn't name. Eventually, my dad forced himself to stand and hesitantly stepped toward the door. He reached for the handle, fingers hesitating before gripping it firmly. He pulled it open again, just enough to peer outside. The night was calm. The garden stretched out before him, bathed in the dim glow of the porch light. Nothing moved. The air was still, heavy, thick. There were no footsteps in the dirt, no sign that anyone had been there. Just the quiet of the world outside and the weight of what had just happened. He stepped back inside and closed the door again, locking it just as my auntie had done minutes before. He turned to look at her, and she was staring at him, her face pale. She had felt it too, that something had just left. Neither of them spoke about it that night. What was there to say? It wasn't the kind of thing you could explain, not in any way that made sense. But it stayed with them, burned into memory, the kind of moment that never dulls with time. Years later, when they spoke about it separately, their stories matched exactly. The details, the feelings, the certainty of what they had witnessed. The door had been locked. There was no wind. It had moved with force, the kind that came from something deliberate, something real. And whether it was just a trick of the air, some unexplainable shift in pressure, or something deeper, something that couldn't be understood, it didn't matter. Because they both knew what they had felt, what they had heard, what they had seen, and whatever it was, it had left the house that night. It started as just another urban exploration trip, the kind my friends and I had done a dozen times before. We were in college, always looking for new places to check out, new places to sneak into, places that had been forgotten. We had heard about an abandoned town tucked into the foothills, just outside the city. It was more than just an old building or a collapsed barn. It was an entire town, hidden behind a fence, left to rot. The stories we heard about it were vague, just rumors about why it had been abandoned. Some people said it was a failed housing development that never took off. Others claimed it was a place where bad things happened, things no one wanted to talk about. None of the stories seemed real, but that just made it more interesting. We packed our flashlights, dressed in black to blend into the night, grabbed some water, and headed out. It was late, around 11:30, when we parked the car a good distance from the entrance. We didn't want to be obvious. We had done this before, and the key to not getting caught was to park far enough away that no one would think twice if they saw the car. We walked down the empty road, the only sound being our footsteps against the pavement and the occasional gust of wind through the trees. There were no streetlights out here, just the darkness pressing in from all sides. When we finally reached the gate, we saw the fence stretching out in both directions. It looked sturdy, tall, built to keep people out. Beyond it, the outlines of buildings barely stood against the night sky. At first glance, they didn't seem like much, just small structures fading into the darkness. But we knew there was more. We just had to get inside. We had heard about a way in, a small hole cut in the fence somewhere along the hillside. The directions were vague. Find the red house across the road, and the path would be near it. We split up, scanning the area until we spotted a house with faded red paint, barely visible under the dim moonlight. That had to be it. From there, we pushed our way through thick brush, clawing through branches, tripping over hidden roots. The hill was steep, and every step felt like a struggle. It wasn't easy, but we finally found the break in the fence. Someone had sawed through the iron, leaving just enough space to squeeze through. The ground beneath it sloped downward sharply, so we had to grab onto branches and the fence itself to keep from sliding down the hill completely. One by one, we pulled ourselves through, dusted off our jeans, and looked up. It wasn't just a few buildings. It was an entire town. A market center, an apartment complex, houses, streets that wound off into the distance. It was eerie, untouched yet decayed, frozen in time. We started walking toward the apartment complex first. It was the largest structure and seemed like the best place to start. The silence was heavy, only broken by our own movements. Then, as we walked, a noise cut through the quiet. A beep. It was faint, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. We all stopped, listening. Another beep. It sounded distant, like it was coming from inside one of the buildings. We hesitated but kept moving. Maybe it was an alarm that had been left behind, a motion detector that still worked after all these years. Inside the apartment complex, the first thing we noticed was the mattress lying in the middle of the floor. It wasn't ancient, not covered in dust the way you'd expect. There were other things too, scattered clothes, discarded trash. It wasn't just abandoned. Someone had been here recently. But the beeping never stopped. It came and went, always distant, always faint. We moved to another apartment. The door creaked as we pushed it open. Inside, the air felt different, thick with something I couldn't describe. The living room was filled with black trench coats. Some were hanging up, others were piled on the floor, scattered like someone had been looking for something and left in a hurry. We didn't stay long. Something about it felt wrong. Upstairs, one of the doors was locked. We didn't try to open it. We just left. Outside, the beeping had changed. It wasn't just one anymore. Multiple beeps were coming from different buildings, each one pulsing in and out, faster now, louder. As we moved, we realized something. The beeping wasn't random. When we walked closer to a building, the beeping inside would speed up. It was tracking us. That's when we saw the house. It was white, peeling, barely standing. But that wasn't what stopped us. The front yard was covered in shattered glass, arranged in neat squares leading up to the door. It wasn't an accident. Someone had placed it there, intentionally. We stood there, staring, trying to make sense of it. Then, from the second floor, a beam of light cut through the darkness. It wasn't just a flashlight, it was searching for something. The beeping in the buildings around us grew frantic, overlapping in a chaotic rhythm. We ran. As soon as we moved, other lights switched on, flickering from different buildings. They weren't normal lights. They moved. They followed us. The beeping reached a fever pitch, coming from every direction. I could see our shadows stretching out in front of us as we sprinted, twisting and distorting in the artificial glow. My friend tripped, hit the pavement hard, but he scrambled back to his feet before I could even reach for him. We didn't stop. The way out was a blur. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my skull. I knew we were being followed. I didn't dare look back, but I saw how the light around me bounced, how it shifted, how it moved like someone, no, multiple people, were closing in. The hole in the fence was ahead. My friend dove through first, hitting the ground on the other side and rolling down the hill. I helped the next one through, then dropped down myself, branches scraping at my arms as I slid. We didn't stop. We didn't breathe. We just ran. The beeping faded behind us, the lights swallowed by the darkness. By the time we reached the car, the road was silent again. It was like none of it had ever happened. We jumped inside, locked the doors, and drove away without saying a word. 3 months later, we went back. Not inside, just to see it. But the town was gone. The gate was torn down, and where buildings had once stood, there was nothing but rubble. We found a construction crew nearby, asked about it. One of the workers barely looked at us before explaining that the place had been a haven for gangs. Drugs, murders, things worse than we wanted to know. The city had finally decided to wipe it off the map. We never talked about it again, but even now, I can still hear the beeping. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when I set out to visit a friend. The air was dry, the sky cloudless, the kind of day where the heat rose in shimmering waves off the pavement. I drove down a familiar two-lane road, an industrial stretch in South Tucson, where the buildings were low, squat, and mostly closed for the weekend. It was the kind of area that seemed to shut down completely outside of business hours, leaving nothing but locked gates, empty parking lots, and the occasional faded sign swinging in the breeze. I wasn't in a rush, but I was keeping pace with the speed limit, about 40 miles per hour, when I came up behind an older sedan crawling along at barely 15 miles per hour. I noticed it from a good distance away, expecting it to either speed up or pull over. But it didn't. It just kept rolling forward like the driver wasn't in any hurry, completely ignoring the fact that I was now trailing behind him. I slowed down, keeping a safe distance at first, but after a few moments of creeping forward, I decided to pass. The road was clear. There were no headlights in the distance, no intersections coming up, just a long, empty stretch of asphalt flanked by fenced-off lots and warehouses. I signaled, checked my mirror, and eased into the opposite lane to go around him. The moment I pulled alongside him, everything changed. The car that had been barely rolling forward suddenly roared to life. His engine revved, tires screeched, and before I could react, he veered sharply into my lane, smashing into the side of my car. The force of the impact yanked the wheel from my grip for a split second, the tires skidding against the pavement as I fought to keep control. My heart shot into my throat. I slammed the brakes, trying to steer away, but he hit me again, harder this time, forcing me toward the shoulder. Gravel crunched beneath my tires as my car fishtailed. I barely had time to think, barely had time to process the fact that this wasn't an accident. This guy was doing this on purpose. I braced myself as my car jolted, the force pushing me toward a stop. The world seemed to slow as the momentum carried me onto the side of the road. I could feel the uneven terrain under the tires, the unsettling shift of the suspension as I finally came to a jerking halt. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my breathing, my pulse hammering in my ears. The smell of hot rubber and dust filled the air. My hands were clenched so tightly around the wheel that my knuckles ached. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my stomach twisted into a tight knot of fear and confusion. I turned my head just in time to see the other driver throwing his door open. He stepped out with a slow, deliberate motion, the kind of movement that sent ice through my veins. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't running toward me in a panic, like someone who had caused an accident. No, he was getting out with purpose, his shoulders squared, his face set in something dark and unreadable. I knew then that this wasn't over. I was alone. There were no other cars on the road, no stores open, no houses nearby. Just rows of silent buildings, chain-link fences topped with barbed wire, and an empty stretch of pavement. My mind raced. Was this some kind of road rage? Was he on something? Did he recognize me? None of it made sense, and none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was that I was cornered, and he was coming toward me. And then I saw them. 2 men standing just a few feet away, as if they had materialized out of nowhere. I hadn't seen them when I pulled over, hadn't noticed them when I was driving. But there they were, positioned near the spot where my car had come to a stop. They didn't belong there. Not in the way that everyone else in this area would have. The workers, the warehouse employees, the truck drivers. These 2 looked entirely out of place in this dead, empty stretch of town. One was tall and pale, a redhead with an angular face and a lean build. The other was shorter, Asian, with dark hair and a calm expression. They weren't talking. They weren't moving toward me or reacting like witnesses to an accident. They were just there, standing still, watching. And the man who had rammed into me, he saw them too. His stride faltered. He looked at them, and for a split second, something in his face changed. The anger, the confidence, the whatever it was that had pushed him to come after me, it drained away. His movements lost their purpose. He hesitated. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Then, just as suddenly, he turned back toward his car, got in, and drove away. I didn't wait. The moment his taillights disappeared down the road, I threw my car into gear and got the hell out of there. My hands were still shaking on the wheel, my mind still trying to process what had happened. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him coming back. But he didn't. The road was empty, silent, as if nothing had ever happened. I never saw those two men move. They didn't approach me, didn't ask if I was okay. They were just there. And then, by the time I had put enough distance between myself and the scene, they were gone. I don't know who they were. I don't know why they were standing in that exact spot at that exact moment, or why their mere presence had been enough to send the man who had attacked me running. I'm not a religious person, never have been, but if there's such a thing as fate or luck, or something beyond what we can explain, that was my brush with it. I've thought about that day countless times, about what might have happened if those two hadn't been there, about what that man had planned to do to me, about how different my life might have been if I had just left my house a few minutes later, or taken a different route, or hesitated just a moment longer before passing him. But none of that happened. What happened was this. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and somehow, against all odds, I made it out okay. And I don't think I was alone. It was summer, the kind that stretched on forever when you were in high school. The days were long and slow, the air thick and sticky even in the evening, the heat still trapped in the pavement long after the sun had gone down. My mom and I had fallen into the habit of going for walks around the neighborhood once it cooled off. We didn't have a set route, just kind of wandered, sometimes looping around twice if we weren't ready to head back home yet. The neighborhood was quiet, just a few streetlights humming, the occasional porch light glowing on someone's front steps. The kind of place where people turned in early, where the only real noise at night came from the trees and the ditches, frogs, crickets, cicadas, all competing in an endless, deafening chorus. That night, it was especially loud. The frogs were everywhere, calling and croaking, their voices bouncing off the houses and the asphalt. It was the sound of summer, a background noise I had never really paid attention to before, until we passed that house. It was a small, single-story home, set a little farther back from the road than the others, with a sagging porch and a dark front window. I had never met the man who lived there, but I knew of him, a widower, quiet, kept to himself. The kind of neighbor you didn't see much, the kind you only remembered when you noticed the mail piling up in the box. At first, I thought it was just part of the noise, the frogs, the wind, maybe someone's TV playing too loud. But as we got closer, I heard it again. A scream. High-pitched, frantic, cut off abruptly, only to start again. Help me. It wasn't words exactly, but it sounded like them. 3, maybe 4 seconds long. Over and over, like a recording stuck on repeat. I stopped walking, turning to my mom, but she had already noticed it too. We stood there on the sidewalk, listening, trying to make sense of it. The house was dark. No lights inside, no movement. Just that sound, coming from somewhere in the yard, or maybe from behind the house. Help me. It didn't change. Didn't get louder or softer. Just the same desperate, looping cry. It's probably a TV, I remember thinking. Maybe the guy had fallen asleep with the volume cranked up. Or maybe he wasn't even home. Maybe he'd left something on, a news report or a crime show. Something that just happened to sound exactly like a person screaming. We kept walking, but neither of us talked much after that. It didn't feel right, but we didn't have a reason for it. Just an uneasy feeling, like the air had thickened, like the night had gotten darker in the last few minutes. I kept glancing over my shoulder as we moved down the street, but there was nothing behind us. No one standing in the shadows, no one at the window. Just the empty house and the sound of the frogs, buzzing and croaking, filling up the spaces between that awful, endless loop of noise. By the time we looped back around, maybe 20 minutes later, the feeling hadn't gone away. The house was still dark. The noise was still playing. I didn't want to stop, but my mom hesitated, her eyes scanning the yard, the windows. Something was off. It had been off the first time, but now it was worse. It felt like walking into a room after something terrible had just happened. Like the air was still heavy with it, even if you didn't know what it was yet. Some of the other neighbors had a key to the place. They checked in on him sometimes, helped with things he couldn't do himself. We went to them, explaining what we had heard, even though saying it out loud made it sound ridiculous. A weird noise, like a scream, like someone saying, "Help me." It sounded stupid. It sounded like something we should have ignored. But the house was dark. He wasn't answering his door, and they hadn't seen him in days. They agreed to check. They went over, unlocked the door, called his name. Nothing. The house smelled. That was the first sign that something was wrong. They found him inside, in his chair, where he had been for over 2 weeks. Dead. The coroner said it was natural causes. Just an old man, alone in his house, slipping away quietly while the world kept moving outside his window. But he had been dead for 2 weeks. The house had been empty. And yet, the noise had been there. The awful looping sound that we had heard so clearly, the one that had pulled us back, made us pay attention. The neighbors didn't hear it. Just the frogs, just the wind. Just another summer night. But my mom and I heard it. And we never walked past that house again. It was a warm summer night, the kind where the air still carried the heat of the day, but cooled just enough to feel comfortable. The streets downtown were buzzing with life, people spilling out of bars, laughing, talking too loud, smoking under streetlights. It was a Friday night, and the city felt alive in that restless way it always did before the weekend truly set in. I wasn't there that night, but I can still picture everything clearly because I've heard the story so many times, and I've seen the way she changes when she tells it. It's not like her usual stories, the ones full of absurd coincidences and ridiculous twists of fate. This one always makes her pause, like she's trying to shake off the weight of it. She was 20 at the time, leaving a bar with a couple of friends. They weren't drunk, just that perfect level of tipsy where the world feels a little softer, where everything is funny and easy. They stood outside on the sidewalk, finishing up their goodbyes, debating whether to get food or just call it a night. The air smelled like asphalt and cigarette smoke, the distant scent of fried food from some late-night takeout place. Then it happened. It was quick, so quick that at first, no one even processed what they were seeing. A guy, maybe in his mid-20s, started shouting at another man a few feet away. There was no build-up, no escalating argument, just a sudden explosion of anger. Something about looking at his girl, about respect. It was the kind of nonsense that didn't even make sense. The kind of thing you expect to fizzle out in a couple of seconds when cooler heads step in. But there was no time for that. The first guy reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. Not a huge one, not something dramatic, just a small, ugly thing. He lunged before anyone could react. One quick, brutal movement, straight to the other guy's stomach. The man made a sound, half a gasp, half a grunt. He staggered back, hands clutching his torso, his face frozen in shock. Then the guy with the knife ran. Just turned and sprinted down the street, disappearing into the crowd like he had never been there at all. And for a few seconds, no one moved. The music from inside the bar kept playing, people kept talking, but out there on the sidewalk, everything had changed. The stabbed man wobbled, took one slow, stumbling step, then collapsed onto the pavement. My friend has always been the kind of person who reacts before she even realizes what she's doing. She doesn't hesitate. Maybe it's instinct, maybe it's just how she's wired. But before anyone else even processed what had happened, she was already moving. She dropped to her knees beside the guy, hands going straight to his stomach. Blood was spilling out fast, soaking through his shirt, pooling on the concrete. It was dark, almost black under the streetlights. Her hands pressed down hard, trying to staunch the flow, trying to stop him from bleeding out right there on the dirty sidewalk. She'd taken first aid classes before, had learned the basics in some long-forgotten training session, but she had never used it for anything real. Now it was all she had to hold on to. Keep pressure on the wound. Keep him conscious. Don't let him slip away. She shouted for someone to call 911. Voices blurred together around her. People were panicking, moving back, standing still, useless. She barely noticed them. Everything narrowed down to the man on the ground, the warmth of his blood seeping through her fingers, his chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. He was young, maybe a little older than her. His face was pale, his eyes wide, unfocused. Time stretched and twisted. She had no idea how long she sat there, holding his life between her hands. Minutes felt like hours. The sounds of the city faded, everything drowned out by the too fast beat of her own heart and the wet, ragged breathing of the man in front of her. She talked to him, though she barely remembers what she said. Just kept him there, kept him from slipping into the dark. The sirens came eventually, screaming through the streets, flashing red and blue reflecting off the glass windows around them. The paramedics were sudden and efficient, voices calm but urgent. Hands replaced hers, firm and practiced. She was pushed back, out of the way, left kneeling on the pavement, her hands slick with blood. She sat down on the nearest bench. Just sat there, staring at her own hands, at the red smeared up her arms. She couldn't move, couldn't process anything. The sounds around her felt distant, like she was underwater. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and the sirens wailed again as it sped off into the night. She didn't know how long she stayed like that. Long enough that the crowd thinned, long enough that the streetlights seemed brighter. Eventually, one of the paramedics came back, a blanket in hand. He draped it over her shoulders, crouched in front of her, asked if she was okay. She didn't answer at first. She wasn't sure she even understood the question. Shock, they told her. Just shock. Her body catching up to what had happened. They talked to her, calmed her down, made sure she wasn't alone. Someone had already cleaned up the blood on the sidewalk, but she could still feel it on her skin, sticky, drying in the creases of her fingers. Her friends took her home. They were quiet in the cab, the night no longer fun, the world no longer light. She showered when she got back, stood under the hot water until her skin felt raw, until the last of the blood swirled down the drain. But she could still feel it. It took days for that feeling to fade, weeks before she stopped flinching at the memory of warm, wet hands, of that blank, terrified face staring up at her. The guy survived. She found out later, maybe a week after it happened. The knife had missed anything vital. He was lucky. So lucky. She should have felt relief, but mostly, she just felt empty. She still tells the story sometimes, but only if you ask. And she never laughs when she does. My dad has never been one to make up stories. He's a practical man, someone who deals in facts and doesn't scare easily. But even years later, he can't tell this story without his hands shaking and the hair on his arms standing up. He still gets goosebumps when he talks about it, and I don't think I've ever seen him genuinely frightened before. That's what makes this all the more unsettling. It happened about 6 months ago when my parents went on vacation to visit their friend's beach house. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, just a few days by the water, enjoying the quiet. Their friends had told them about the house next door, about how it had changed hands 5 times in the 3 years they had owned their place. They never went into too much detail, but there was always something odd about the way they talked about it. The most recent owner had died there just 3 weeks before my parents arrived. He had taken his own life. No one knew exactly why, but people speculated. My parents spent the day settling in, walking along the beach, and having dinner at a small seafood place nearby. The weather was perfect, warm with a light breeze, and everything felt normal. They got back to the house around 10 p.m., watched some TV, and got ready for bed. It was quiet except for the occasional sound of the waves in the distance. Nothing out of the ordinary. As my dad was brushing his teeth, he noticed something. A faint smell, something sharp and chemical in the air. It wasn't strong, just enough to make him stop for a second and try to place it. Gas. The smell of gas. He thought maybe it was just from the stove, but when he checked, everything inside was off. Still, something didn't feel right. He decided to go outside and check the gas line. It was a short walk from the back door, just a few steps around the side of the house. The air was a little cooler than before, and for some reason, he felt uneasy. He wasn't the type to get scared easily, but something about being outside alone in the dark unsettled him. He shook it off and kept walking, telling himself it was just in his head. As he reached the gas line, the smell was stronger. He found the shut-off valve and reached for it, twisting it closed. It should have been a simple thing, just a quick turn and then back inside, but that's when he heard it. A voice, right behind him. "What are you doing?" It was clear. Not a whisper, not a muffled sound from a distance. It was as if someone was standing just a few feet away, speaking directly to him. Without thinking, he responded, shutting off the gas. As soon as the words left his mouth, something in him snapped. He realized what had just happened. He was alone. There was no one else outside. His breath caught in his throat, and he turned quickly, scanning the yard, the shadows, the fence line. There was no one. His mind raced. He tried to convince himself he had imagined it, that it had been some kind of trick of the wind or a distant voice carried from another house. But it had been too clear, too close. It had been right there. He didn't wait to think about it any longer. He turned and walked quickly back to the house, his pulse hammering in his ears. The moment he was inside, he locked the door behind him. My mom was in the bathroom, still brushing her teeth, completely unaware of what had just happened. She looked up when he walked in, and he could see his own pale reflection in the mirror. He didn't say anything. He just stood there for a moment, trying to steady his breathing, trying to convince himself that he hadn't really heard it, that he was just on edge from the smell of gas, from being outside in the dark, from knowing what had happened in that house next door. But he couldn't shake the feeling. The rest of the night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every small sound outside made his chest tighten. At 3 a.m., he had enough. He woke my mom and told her they were leaving. She didn't argue. Something about the way he said it, the look in his eyes, was enough to tell her it wasn't just his imagination. They packed their bags and left, driving through the dark without saying much. The next day, they called their friends, the ones who owned the beach house, to tell them what happened. My dad told them about the gas, about the voice, about how he couldn't sleep and had to leave. When he finished, there was silence on the other end of the phone. Then, their friends told them something that made my dad's stomach drop. The man who had lived next door, the one who had died just weeks before, had taken his own life by gassing himself inside the house. My dad still can't explain what happened that night. He doesn't talk about it often, but when he does, you can see it in his face, the fear, the memory of standing outside alone in the dark and hearing something that shouldn't have been there. Something that, no matter how much he tries to rationalize it, he can't explain. And maybe that's what scares him the most, not knowing. I never thought much about the stories you hear, urban legends, warnings from cautious friends, the cautionary tales meant to scare women into being careful. They always seemed distant, like they belonged to someone else's reality, something that happened to strangers in some far-off place. But after what happened to my friend's friend, I don't think I'll ever look at things the same way again. She had been going through a rough time, a bad breakup, stress at work, life feeling like it was weighing too heavy on her shoulders. Vegas seemed like the perfect escape. A few days of drinking, dancing, and pretending the rest of the world didn't exist. She booked the trip on impulse, packed a suitcase full of outfits meant to make her forget she was miserable, and left without telling too many people. Just a quick getaway. Nothing serious. The night she met him, she had already been drinking. Not too much, just enough to feel loose, enough to dance without overthinking, enough to smile more easily. The club was packed, pulsing with bass, filled with people who, like her, just wanted to lose themselves for a little while. That's when she noticed him. He was good-looking. Not the kind of good-looking that makes a man seem unattainable, just the kind that makes him stand out. Tall, sharp jawline, dark eyes that seemed to notice her before she noticed him. He smiled at her from across the bar, and she smiled back. Simple as that. They danced together, close enough that she could feel his breath on her skin. He bought her drinks. He laughed at her jokes. He made her feel wanted, special. It had been a long time since she had felt like that. They made out in a dark corner of the club, his hands gripping her waist, his lips rough but confident. He asked her to come home with him. She thought about it. Of course she did. He was charming, but she wasn't that kind of person. Not really. So she said no, but they exchanged numbers. They made plans to meet up again. A safer option, she thought. She left Vegas a couple of days later. The trip had done what she needed it to do. She felt lighter. She had a good time. She told her friends about the guy, laughing about how tempting he was, about how she might actually text him again sometime. Then the sores appeared. At first, it was just irritation around her lips. She thought maybe she had just been careless with her chapstick. Maybe the dry air had gotten to her. But then it got worse. The skin became raw, painful. Small blisters formed, then burst, leaving open wounds that oozed. She woke up one morning to find her pillow smeared with something dark, her mouth burning, the pain almost unbearable. She went to the doctor. She sat in the waiting room, feeling embarrassed, hoping it was just some common infection that would go away with antibiotics. The doctor examined her for a long time, asking questions she didn't fully understand. Had she been traveling? Had she kissed anyone? Had she eaten anything unusual? They took swabs, ran tests. When the results came back, the doctor's face changed. There was something in his eyes, discomfort, uncertainty, like he wasn't sure how to tell her what he needed to say. The bacteria in her wounds wasn't common. In fact, it was almost unheard of. Flesh-eating bacteria. Not just any kind, but a strain that is found only in people who consume human flesh. She didn't understand at first. How could she have come into contact with something like that? The doctor was careful with his words, but the implication was clear. It had come from the man she had kissed, the man she had met in Vegas. She left the clinic in a daze, the antibiotics in her bag feeling useless in the face of what she had just learned. How was this real? How did this happen to her? What kind of person had she been with? She could still feel the pressure of his lips on hers, the way he had held her, the way she had wanted him. She felt sick. She called the police. She didn't even know what to say at first. How do you report something like this? She told them everything, his name, his number, where she had met him. They took her seriously. Too seriously. It wasn't the kind of thing they could brush off. A strain of bacteria like that didn't just appear out of nowhere. They found his apartment. They found body parts in the fridge. The police told her later that he had been doing this for a while. Going to clubs, meeting women, taking them home, and then eating them. They found remains in his freezer, bags of flesh wrapped in plastic like cuts of meat from a butcher shop. He had been careful. He knew how to hide it, but not careful enough. The bacteria gave him away. She never found out what happened to him after that. She didn't want to know. She couldn't even bring herself to read the news articles when they started coming out. It was too much. She had been so close to becoming one of them. Another nameless woman in a cold storage unit. Another girl who disappeared in a city full of people too busy with their own lives to notice. The sores on her mouth healed. Physically, she recovered, but she was never the same after that. Something in her had changed. She didn't go out much anymore. She barely dated. The thought of being close to a stranger made her stomach turn. She had nightmares, dark rooms, the feeling of hands gripping her too tightly, the taste of blood in her mouth. And she told her friends, over and over again, with more urgency than she ever had before, never go home with a man you just met. Never trust a charming smile. Never think that something like this couldn't happen to you. Because it can. And for her, it almost did. It was 2005, and I was 15 years old, on holiday with my family in Cancun, Mexico. It was the kind of vacation that felt like a dream, the kind you think back on years later and wonder if it really happened the way you remember it. The heat was different from what I was used to back home in England, thicker, heavier, clinging to my skin even when I was in the shade. The air smelled of salt and sunscreen, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore mixed with the hum of tourists and the occasional shout of vendors selling souvenirs along the beach. That afternoon, I had been in the ocean for what felt like hours. The water was warm, clear enough to see the fish darting around my feet, and the waves were just strong enough to be fun without being dangerous. By the time I got out, my skin was tight with salt, my hair stiff from the dried seawater. I decided to head back to the apartment to rinse off and change before grabbing something to eat. My family was still out, probably exploring or lounging by the pool, so I had the place to myself. The apartment wasn't anything fancy, just a simple rental with white walls and tiled floors that always felt a little damp no matter how much air conditioning was running. My room was small but comfortable, with a bed that had the kind of thin hotel sheets that felt cool against sunburnt skin. I grabbed some clean clothes from my suitcase and stepped into the bathroom, shutting the door behind me. As soon as the door clicked shut, I felt something drop onto my hand. At first, I didn't even look. It was small, almost weightless, just the barest touch against my skin. But then instinct took over. Something had fallen on me. Something alive. I glanced down, expecting to see a stray piece of lint or a small bug. Instead, my eyes locked onto a large black creature clinging to the back of my hand. It had too many legs. More than I was comfortable counting in that moment of blind panic. My stomach twisted, my breath caught in my throat, and every muscle in my body seized up. A spider. A massive, Horrible, alien-looking spider. At least, that's what I thought at the time. It covered the entire back of my hand, its legs splayed out, its body heavy enough that I could actually feel it pressing against my skin. I reacted before my brain could fully process what I was looking at. I let out a guttural, panicked roar, something between a battle cry and a dying animal's scream, and started shaking my hand violently, as if my sheer terror alone could force the creature to release me. My feet scrambled for higher ground, and before I knew it, I was standing on the toilet seat, balancing precariously while flailing my arm like a lunatic. The thing finally lost its grip and tumbled to the floor. It landed with a soft, almost inaudible sound, legs curled slightly inward. It didn't move. I stood there, panting, sweat forming on my forehead despite the air conditioning. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. For a brief, shining moment, I thought I had won. I had faced the beast, and I had triumphed. Cautiously, I lowered one foot back to the floor, creeping forward to inspect my fallen adversary. Maybe I had killed it. Maybe the impact had been too much for its fragile, spindly body. Then, without warning, it moved. Not just moved, scurried. With a speed I had not been prepared for, it bolted across the tiles straight toward me. I screamed. A real scream this time, high-pitched and desperate, the kind of sound that would have made my friends back home never let me live it down. I scrambled back onto the toilet, my eyes locked on the horror before me. It wasn't just moving. It was coming for me. It reached the base of the toilet, and then, somehow, started climbing the door. I didn't even know spiders could do that. But then again, I didn't know much about giant Mexican spiders. Maybe this was one of those nightmare species that could climb walls, leap through the air, maybe even fly. At that moment, I believed anything was possible. It stopped near the top of the door, its body motionless once more. We stared at each other, locked in a silent battle of wills. My sanctuary was no longer safe. I was trapped. I had nowhere to go, no way to escape without risking the possibility of it dropping onto me again. But then something shifted. My panic started to fade, just a little. The longer I looked at it, the more I noticed something was off. It only had 6 legs. I frowned, my breath still coming in sharp gasps. Spiders had 8 legs, didn't they? Every spider I had ever seen had 8. But this thing, it moved strangely too. Not like a spider at all. Its legs weren't bending the way I expected, and the shape of its body wasn't quite right. A memory stirred in the back of my mind, something I had seen before but couldn't immediately place. I narrowed my eyes, studying it more closely. The legs, the body. A crab. A goddamn crab. A sudden wave of exhaustion washed over me, like my body had just realized how much energy I had wasted freaking out. My legs wobbled slightly, and I slowly stepped down from the toilet, still keeping a cautious distance from the little intruder. It wasn't a spider at all. It was some kind of small crab, completely black, and missing its pincers. How it had gotten into the bathroom, I had no idea. There were no windows, and the door had been shut the entire time. But somehow, this little bastard had made its way inside, probably just as confused about the situation as I was. I sighed, running a hand down my face. The adrenaline crash was hitting hard, leaving me feeling stupid and exhausted. Now that I wasn't convinced I was about to die, I had to figure out how to get rid of it. I grabbed a small pan from under the sink, moving carefully so I wouldn't spook it into running at me again. With some careful maneuvering, I managed to trap it inside and quickly flipped the pan upright, holding it at arm's length as I carried it out of the apartment. The lagoon wasn't far, just a short walk from where we were staying. I made my way there, ignoring the odd looks I got from a few passing tourists. If only they knew the ordeal I had just been through. When I reached the water's edge, I crouched down and tilted the pan, watching as the little creature scuttled out onto the sand. It paused for a moment, as if taking in its new surroundings, before scurrying toward the water. I like to think an alligator ate it. The little fucker. When I was 13 years old, I got my first period. I remember it vividly because it wasn't just the physical discomfort that made the night unforgettable. It was what happened after I fell asleep. I had never been someone who slept on their back. Ever since I was a child, I curled up on my side without thinking. It was natural. But that night, for whatever reason, I ended up flat on my back. The strangeness of that position didn't occur to me until much later. At some point in the night, I found myself in a dream. In the dream, I was sitting in a chair. A simple, wooden chair. I had leaned back onto its rear legs, balancing in that precarious way kids do when they want to test gravity. The chair started to tip further back than I intended. I tried to shift my weight forward to correct it, but it didn't help. Instead of slamming back onto all four legs, the chair kept going, past the point of no return. I wasn't falling backwards in the normal way. It was slower, more controlled, like I was sinking into something deep and endless. There was nothing below me, just a black void stretching into eternity, and I was drifting into it. I jolted awake. The sensation of falling lingered as my eyes snapped open, my heart hammering in my chest. My breath caught in my throat before I could even register what had scared me so badly. A figure was hovering over me, its face inches from mine. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The weight of it pressed down on me. Not physically, but something deeper than that, something that filled the air with suffocating intensity. The face was pale, white, almost featureless, with a smooth, flat surface where cheekbones and a nose should have been. The eyes were massive, black and glossy like the surface of a pond at night, reflecting nothing back but the terror I felt. The mouth was thin, just a barely there line of lips drawn tight in a trembling, furious expression. Two small holes sat where a nose should have been. Its eyebrows were high, arched unnaturally as if carved into place, frozen in an expression of hunger and hate. I couldn't process what I was seeing. I was 13 years old, and I didn't believe in monsters. I didn't believe in demons or spirits or anything like that. But what I was looking at wasn't human, and it wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. It was something real, something that radiated a malice so pure that I could feel it burning into me like fire. I wanted to scream, to flail, to push it away, but my body wouldn't respond. My muscles were locked in place, my lungs refusing to pull in air. I was trapped in my own skin, completely at its mercy. The longer I stared into those glossy black eyes, the more I felt like I was unraveling. Like it wasn't just my life that was in danger, but something deeper than that, something more permanent. It wasn't just looking at me. It was consuming me, drinking in my fear with slow, deliberate satisfaction. I forced my throat to work, to make any sound at all. The only thing I managed was a tiny, pathetic whimper. The moment that sound escaped my lips, the figure moved. It straightened up suddenly, its impossibly tall body unfolding like a shadow stretching across a wall. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, like liquid pouring upwards into the shape of a man. Its cloak, long and black, shifted as it rose, swallowing the dim light from my nightstand lamp. Then it started pacing at the foot of my bed, back and forth. Slow, deliberate, its head never turning away from me. The tension in the room shifted, thickening like smoke in my throat. It was angry, frustrated. I could feel it vibrating in the air, seeping into my bones. Whatever had paralyzed me was still holding it back, and it knew it. It was like watching a starving animal trapped behind glass, its prey just out of reach. I was still sitting up, my body half rigid, my fingers clutching the sheets without realizing it. My closet door was cracked open just a few inches behind it, a dark sliver of space barely noticeable in the dim light. And then, without breaking eye contact, it moved toward the closet. It didn't turn. It just shifted, as though its form wasn't bound by the same laws as everything else in the room. 1 second it was standing at the foot of my bed, and the next, it was slipping through that narrow gap in the door, folding itself into the darkness without sound. It stared at me from within. The pale face hovered in the gap, its expression unchanged, still quivering with unrestrained hate. It was waiting, watching, testing the invisible barrier between us. Then, slowly, its form began to fade. It wasn't like a light switching off or a shadow dissipating. It was like it was being pulled back, sucked into something beyond my sight, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but darkness. I didn't move for a long time. I kept staring at the closet, my body locked in place, my brain refusing to process what had just happened. When I finally broke free from whatever held me still, I lunged for my bedside lamp, flipping it on with trembling fingers. The light flooded the room, chasing away the shadows, but it did nothing to calm the terror clawing its way through me. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, every single light in the house blazing. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. For years, I told myself it had been sleep paralysis. It made sense. The inability to move, the hallucination, the overwhelming sense of dread. It all lined up with what I had read about the condition. I buried the memory, convincing myself that it had been nothing more than a cruel trick of my own mind. Then, years later, I met a girl who told me a story. She had been up late one night, sitting in her room with the door open. Something in the living room had caught her eye. When she turned to look, she saw a figure standing there, watching her. It raised one hand and beckoned her to come closer. She had looked away, trying to convince herself it wasn't real. When she glanced back, it was still there. When she described it to me, every word sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. The face, the eyes, the expression, it was all the same. We grabbed sketchbooks and, without speaking another word, we both drew what we had seen. When I looked at her drawing, I felt my stomach drop. It was identical to mine. I never slept with my closet door open again. I don't remember much about Ernie's earliest days, just that my dad found him in a junkyard when I was about 4 years old. My dad worked as a mechanic, and I guess one day, while hauling off scrap, he spotted a little dog poking around the rusted-out husks of old cars. He wasn't much to look at then, small, bony, with scruffy, patchy fur and eyes that seemed too big for his face. He looked like one of those little chihuahuas you see shaking in a lady's purse. My dad figured he'd take him home just long enough to bring him to the shelter, but I had other ideas. I begged to keep him. I promised, swore up and down that I'd take care of him, that I'd watch him, that I'd make sure he didn't get into trouble. We lived in the middle of nowhere, out in the plains of the Texas Panhandle, and I figured there was plenty of space for him to run around. My parents must have thought he wouldn't last long, scrawny thing that he was, because they gave in and let me keep him. I named him Ernie, after Sesame Street, because at 4 years old, that was about the most important thing in my life. For a while, he stayed small, but then, slowly, he started to change. His legs got longer, his frame filled out, and his fur grew thick and glossy. By the time I was 9, Ernie was nothing like the little scrap of a dog my dad had found. He was big, bigger than any dog I'd seen around our parts, with strong muscles and a wide chest. His fur had turned a rich golden brown, thick like a wolf's, and when he stood next to me, his back was nearly at my waist. People who visited, though we didn't have many visitors, would ask what kind of dog he was, but we never knew. He looked like no breed I'd ever seen. I didn't care what he was. He was my best friend. I was allowed to drive the golf cart to my grandparents' house after school, a little over 2 miles across open fields with a few fences in between. It wasn't a road, just a well-worn dirt path we used, cutting through the dry grass. Most days, Ernie would follow along beside me, trotting along at an easy pace, his tongue lolling out, his tail wagging lazily. He never seemed to get tired, never strayed too far. I talked to him like he was another person, telling him about my day, my thoughts, my worries, whatever came to mind. He never answered, obviously, but sometimes he'd look up at me, his dark eyes calm and knowing, like he understood every word. One afternoon, like any other, I set out for my grandparents' house in the golf cart. The sun was high, the heat pressing down like a weight. The air shimmered over the fields, and the dust kicked up in little swirls behind me. I was halfway there when the golf cart sputtered, jerked, and then died completely. I tried turning the key again, but the battery was drained. Nothing. I sighed, already dreading the long walk. There was no one around, nothing but miles of dry land stretching in all directions. The nearest road was too far to see. I was alone, except for Ernie. He stood a few feet away, panting lightly, waiting for me like he always did. I climbed out of the cart and started walking. He fell into step beside me, his head held high, ears twitching at the sounds around us. I wasn't worried at first. It was just a walk, something I'd done plenty of times before. The grass rustled in the wind, the fence posts stood like sentinels in the distance, and the sun hung heavy in the sky, casting long shadows. Ernie padded along, quiet and steady. Then, out of nowhere, he stopped. His ears perked up, his body stiffened, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. I turned to look at him, surprised. I had never heard him growl like that before, not at me. He was staring straight at me, his lips pulling back to reveal his teeth. My heart stuttered. I had just seen Old Yeller a few weeks before, and my mind jumped to the worst possible conclusion. Rabies. I didn't know much about it, but I knew it made dogs turn. I took a step back, and Ernie let out a deeper growl, his muscles bunching like he was about to lunge. Panic surged through me. I turned to run, but before I could take more than 2 steps, he lunged forward and knocked me to the ground. I hit the dirt hard, dust flying up around me. He stood over me, not biting, not attacking, just pinning me down with his weight. His growl faded, but he didn't move. I was too scared to fight him. I lay there, breathing hard, my heart pounding against my ribs. Then, after what felt like forever, he finally stepped off me. I scrambled to my feet, ready to bolt, but he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring past me, toward the ditch that ran alongside the trail. His body was still rigid, his tail straight, his ears locked forward. Something was there. I followed his gaze, squinting against the glare of the sun. At first, I didn't see anything. Just dried grass, a few scattered rocks, the same landscape I'd seen 1,000 times before. And then I saw them. A nest of rattlesnakes, coiled and writhing in the grass, barely a few feet ahead of where I had been walking. Dozens of them, thick and long, their scales catching the light. Some were still, their bodies twisted together, while others slithered lazily over each other. Their rattles buzzed, an eerie, dry sound that sent chills up my spine. If Ernie hadn't stopped me, I would have walked right into them. My stomach turned to ice. I took a shaky step back, my legs trembling. Ernie stayed where he was, still as stone, watching the snakes with unblinking eyes. I knew I couldn't go forward. I had to go back. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, my breath burning in my chest. Ernie didn't follow right away. When I finally reached the golf cart and turned, he was still standing there, his body tense, his eyes locked on the ditch. Then slowly, he backed away and trotted after me. When I got home, I was shaking too hard to talk at first. I finally managed to tell my dad, and his face darkened. He grabbed his gun without a word and walked out toward the trail, Ernie at his side. It felt like an eternity before I heard the gunshot. When my dad came back, his face was pale. He didn't say much, just muttered something about there being too many of them for me to have missed. If Ernie hadn't stopped me, there was no way I would have walked out of that alive. That night, I sat on the porch with Ernie, running my fingers through his thick fur. He lay beside me, calm as ever, his tail flicking lazily. I had always known he was special, but that day, he saved my life, and I never forgot it. It was late afternoon when the call came in. A small plane had gone down in the hills just outside of town. The dispatcher's voice was calm but firm, the way it always was when something bad had happened. My heart dropped as soon as I heard the words, "possible survivors unknown." That usually meant the crash was bad, and when a crash is bad, the chances of finding anyone alive are next to nothing. I had been with the county search and rescue team for a few years by then. I'd seen a lot, lost hikers, drowned fishermen, car wrecks on remote roads, but something about this call made my stomach tighten. The sheriff's department was already on the scene, but they needed us to help with the recovery. That word, recovery, it told me everything I needed to know. By the time I arrived at the staging area, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. The air was cool, the way it always got in the evenings up here, no matter how hot the day had been. A few of the senior members of the team were huddled near the sheriff, their faces grim. I grabbed my gear and walked over listening. "Elderly couple," the sheriff said, "and their granddaughter." Silence. That deep, heavy silence that only comes when people hear something too awful to respond to. I saw the way shoulders slumped, the way eyes dropped to the ground. We all knew this wasn't going to be just another call. The crash site was on a steep hillside, deep in the forest. We couldn't drive all the way in, so we hiked the last half mile on foot. The smell hit first. That acrid stench of burned metal and fuel, mixed with something else. Something worse. Trees had been snapped in half, their trunks splintered and raw. Pieces of the plane were scattered everywhere, a trail of wreckage leading down the slope. The lead turned to us and said anyone who wasn't comfortable handling the bodies could step back. No judgment, no hard feelings. This wasn't for everyone. I saw some people hesitate, then step away. They would help in other ways, setting up the ropes, making calls, but they wouldn't be the ones to go down and bring them back. I swallowed hard and kept moving. Navigating the wreckage was slow. Every step had to be careful. Loose dirt and torn branches made the ground unstable. I could hear my own breath, slow and steady, as I picked my way through the debris. Then I saw it, a teddy bear. It was small, maybe the size of my hand, and soaked in blood. It was lying among the twisted pieces of the plane, half buried in the dirt. My chest tightened, but I kept moving. I couldn't stop. Not yet. We found them not far from the main wreckage. The little girl was still strapped into what was left of her seat, her body limp, her face pale, her eyes open but empty, staring at nothing. The grandparents were nearby, their bodies twisted and broken. There was no movement, no sound but the distant calls of the team above us and the rustling of the wind through the trees. I don't know how long we stood there, taking it in. It felt like forever. My brain was trying to catch up, trying to process the reality of what I was looking at. But there was no processing something like this. You just had to push through. We worked methodically, gently, carefully placing each body into the bags. It was harder with the girl. She was so small. It didn't feel right. None of it felt right. The hike back up was slow, hard. The weight of the gear, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say. Back at the staging area, we handed them over to the coroner's team. The sheriff thanked us, but it barely registered. I just nodded and walked away, needing space, needing air. I sat on the bumper of a truck and stared at the ground. My hands were shaking, just a little. I had seen death before, plenty of times. But this was different. This was a child. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The image of that teddy bear burned into my mind. The blood, the little girl's empty eyes. For days afterward, I went through the motions of life feeling like a ghost. I would catch myself zoning out, my mind drifting back to that hillside, to the wreckage, to the awful silence of it all. I didn't talk about it. Not really. What was there to say? People die every day. Accidents happen. But that didn't make it easier. Eventually, the numbness faded. Slowly, over time. But it never fully went away. And I don't think it ever will. Some things just stay with you. I was about 10 or 11 years old when this happened. I remember it vividly, burned into my memory like a bad dream I could never wake up from. That day, I was sick, not sick enough to be completely bedridden, but enough that my parents decided I should stay home from school. Both of them worked and couldn't take the day off, so they gave me strict instructions before they left that morning. Stay in the house, don't open the door for anyone, and call them if I needed anything. I had heard these rules many times before, the usual talks about strangers, but it never really sank in how serious those warnings were until that day. I spent most of the morning on the couch in the living room, wrapped up in a blanket, watching cartoons. The house felt different when I was in it alone. Even though I'd spent countless hours there, something about knowing no one else was home made it feel bigger, quieter. The only sound was the faint hum of the television, accompanied by the occasional car passing by on the main road outside. The front room had a large bay window that faced the street. It was a main road, busy with people walking to and from the row of shops across the way. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after a while, I started feeling uncomfortable. I didn't like the idea of people seeing me sitting there alone, so I got up and pulled the curtains closed just enough to block their view, while still letting some light in. That's when I noticed him. A man, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, was walking past the house. He had a beard and glasses, and was wearing a green knitted jumper. There was nothing immediately alarming about him, but something about the way he walked past just felt off. He wasn't looking at the shops or at his phone like most people did. His eyes were scanning houses, glancing around in a way that seemed unnatural. It made me uneasy, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just lost or waiting for someone. About 10 minutes later, I saw him again. He was walking in the same direction, as if he had looped around the block. That was weird. Most people only walked past once, maybe twice if they forgot something at the shops, but he had no bags, no indication he had gone inside anywhere. He just walked the same route again. This time, I didn't look away so quickly. I watched him, and as he passed the house, his gaze lingered on it a little too long. Another 10 minutes passed, and then he came back. But this time, he stopped. He stood at the edge of the driveway, just standing there, staring at the window. I could feel my heart rate pick up. I told myself he was just resting, maybe waiting for someone. But after nearly 30 seconds, he started walking towards the front door. The house was old, a Victorian-style sandstone building with big storm doors that required a key to open. He couldn't just walk in, but that didn't stop him from trying. He knocked, not loudly at first, but enough that I heard it. I froze. I wasn't supposed to answer the door, I knew that. But my heart was pounding in my chest so hard that I felt like he could hear it from outside. Then, He stepped back and looked at the window as he walked by. I ducked down behind the couch, hoping he hadn't seen me. I held my breath, listening. The knocking stopped, but then I heard a different sound, banging. Harder this time. He was knocking on the window. I could hear his voice, muffled by the glass, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. Then I saw it, the moment of realization on his face. His eyes flickered towards the side of the house, and I knew instantly what he was thinking. The back door. My parents never locked the back door during the day. We had a dog that liked to come in and out, and they always left it open for him. That thought sent a wave of pure terror through me. I scrambled to my feet and ran towards the kitchen. As soon as I reached the door, my hands fumbled with the lock. My fingers felt clumsy, numb with fear. Just as I twisted the key and locked it, the handle started turning. He was already there. The door shook as he yanked the handle harder. Then came the pounding, loud, urgent. He wasn't just checking if the door was open anymore. He was trying to get in. I backed away slowly, my legs shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. My breathing was shallow, rapid. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I dropped to the floor, curling up in a ball against the cabinets, trying to make myself as small as possible. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Where would I go? The phone was in the living room, but that meant going back where he could see me. I was paralyzed. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, listening to him trying the windows, moving around the house. Every second that passed felt like an hour. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The banging, the rattling, everything went silent. I stayed there, frozen, for what must have been another 30 minutes, maybe more. I didn't dare move, afraid that he was still out there waiting. Finally, I forced myself to stand and peek through the back window. He was gone. The street was empty, just the usual cars passing by, oblivious to what had just happened. When my parents got home, I told them everything. My dad immediately checked all the locks, making sure every door and window was secure. My mom hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. They called the police, but by then, the man was long gone. They said they'd keep an eye out, but I never saw him again. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were, but I don't need to. I know that if I hadn't remembered to lock that back door, things could have ended very differently. The thought still haunts me. I never forgot that day, and I never forgot the feeling of absolute helplessness. Even now, years later, I always double-check every lock before I go to bed, because I know that sometimes the worst kind of fear isn't the kind that hides in the shadows. It's the kind that walks right up to your front door in broad daylight. I got off the bus 2 stops early, like I had done a few times before. The walk to my friend's house wasn't long, just a few blocks. The afternoon sun was still bright, stretching shadows across the sidewalk. It wasn't a big deal. I'd hang out for a couple of hours, play some games, then head home before my mom even really noticed. She wasn't strict, but she expected me home at the usual time, and I figured I'd get a mild lecture for being late. Nothing major. Inside my friend's house, the air was cool from the AC, a sharp contrast to the late summer heat outside. We settled into his room, controllers in hand, the familiar sounds of explosions and gunfire from the game filling the space. Time passed quickly, and I wasn't checking my phone. It wasn't until his mom knocked on the door, phone in hand, that I realized something was wrong. "It's your mom," she said, her voice tight. "She sounds upset." I took the phone, expecting the usual, but her voice was more than angry, it was panicked. She demanded I come home immediately. No arguing, no explanations, just come home now. I barely had time to say goodbye before I was out the door, walking fast, then jogging. The whole way home, I tried to figure out what I could have done to make her this mad. Maybe she had called my phone and I hadn't answered. Maybe a neighbor saw me get off the bus early and snitched. But that didn't explain the fear I heard in her voice. By the time I reached my house, my mom was waiting just inside the door. My sister and her friend were there too, both of them looking shaken. My mom immediately started firing questions at me. Where had I been? What had I been doing? Who was I with? I told her the truth. I had been at my friend's house since school ended. I hadn't gone anywhere else, hadn't seen anyone else. She didn't believe me. She kept shaking her head, muttering that it wasn't possible. I tried to ask what she meant, but she just sent me to my room, telling me we'd talk later. I sat on my bed, confused and frustrated. It wasn't until my sister came in that I started to understand. She sat down on the edge of my bed, looking pale. "Mom swears she saw you outside." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She took a breath and told me everything. While I had been at my friend's house, my mom had been upstairs, folding laundry in her room. The window overlooked our backyard. It wasn't a huge yard, mostly patchy grass and a few trees near the fence. My sister and her friend had been sitting out there talking. Then my mom heard my name. A man's voice, deep, coming from outside. When she looked, she saw me. Or at least, she thought she did. She saw a guy with no shirt on, standing behind my sister's friend. His arms were around her, almost like a hug. My mom was immediately furious. She thought I was messing around with my sister's friend in the backyard, in broad daylight, where anyone could see. She stormed downstairs, ready to drag me inside and yell at me for being so inappropriate. But when she got out there, the guy was gone. It was just my sister and her friend, sitting there like they had been the whole time. My mom demanded to know where I went. They looked at her, confused. They told her no one else had been there. It had just been the two of them talking. My mom didn't believe them. She kept saying she had seen me. She had heard my name. She was sure of it. The more they insisted, the angrier she got, thinking they were covering for me. She searched the yard, the bushes, even the side of the house, but there was no one there. She called my phone, no answer. Then she called my friend's house. And that's when she realized I had been nowhere near home. Even as my sister told me all of this, I kept shaking my head. It didn't make sense. There was no way my mom could have seen me. I wasn't there. I hadn't been there. And yet, she had seen someone. Someone who looked like me. Someone who said my name. That's when my sister hesitated, then said something that made my skin crawl. Her friend had come over today for a reason. It was the anniversary of her fiancé's death. He had taken his own life exactly 1 year ago, and his name was the same as mine. I didn't know what to say. My sister looked shaken. I felt cold. I could still hear my mom downstairs, pacing, probably trying to make sense of it herself. I had no explanation, no way to make it add up. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about what my mom had seen, what she had heard. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been a neighbor, someone with a similar build, just passing through the yard. Maybe my mom had been caught up in the moment, seeing what she expected to see. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. She had seen his face. She had heard my name. And when she got outside, there was no one there. The next morning, no one talked about it. My mom didn't bring it up again. My sister and her friend acted normal, but there was a tension in the air, something unspoken. Life moved on. The yard stayed the same. But every time I stepped outside, I found myself glancing around, half expecting to see someone standing there watching. When I was a kid, I had to go to bed early, 8 o'clock sharp. It didn't matter if I wasn't tired, if I was in the middle of something, or if I could hear my family still up, laughing in the kitchen. My mom would come into my room, tuck me in, and turn off the lights. The hallway light stayed on, though, and the door stayed cracked open just a little, letting the glow spill in. I hated lying there in the dark, staring at that light, knowing that life was still happening outside my room while I was stuck there, wide awake. I'd squint at the light, watching the way it stretched and blurred, making the rays extend as far as possible. It was something to do, at least. I'd listen to the sounds of my family, my mom and dad talking, my sister laughing, the clatter of dishes, the occasional hum of the refrigerator kicking on, all those sounds of home that made me feel safe. Then, out of nowhere, she was there, an old woman, standing just inside my room, right where the glow from the hallway met the dark. She wasn't solid. I could see through her, right to my dresser and the wall behind her. Her hair was long, curly, and yellow, not golden, not blonde, but yellow, like something faded by time. She wore a dress, purple with little flowers all over it. But what froze me in place, what made my stomach twist into a knot so tight I thought I'd throw up, was her smile. It was huge, too big. It stretched across her face in a way that wasn't right. Not like a normal smile. It took up half her face, her lips pulled so far back it almost seemed painful. And she was staring at me, just standing there, unmoving, watching me with that grin. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My throat locked up. My whole body felt like it had turned to stone. My breath was stuck in my chest. I couldn't look away, couldn't blink. I just lay there, frozen, feeling my heartbeat hammering so hard it hurt. The seconds stretched forever, her gaze locked onto me, unblinking, that awful smile never fading. Then somehow my body broke free. I yanked the blanket over my head, squeezing my eyes shut so tightly they burned. I lay there shaking, the darkness under the blanket suffocating, hot, but I couldn't move, couldn't peek. I didn't care if I overheated, if I couldn't breathe. I wasn't coming out. I listened, straining to hear anything, any sound that wasn't my own panicked breathing. Nothing. Just the distant sounds of my family, still in the kitchen, still normal, still safe. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but at some point, I must have passed out. When I woke up, my room was bright with morning light, the hallway silent now. My heart still felt heavy, my body sluggish, like I had barely slept at all. The weight of the night before sat on me, thick and cold, refusing to fade even in the daylight. I wasn't sure if I should say anything. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe my brain had twisted some shadow into something terrible. But it felt too real. The memory of that smile was too sharp, too clear. So I asked my sister, trying to sound casual, even though my voice still shook a little. Did an old lady visit us last night? She looked at me like I was crazy. No. I told her what I had seen. The woman, the dress, the way she had just stood there, grinning. My sister thought about it for a second, and then said something that, at the time, I wanted to believe. Maybe it was your guardian angel. At first, I tried to make myself accept that. I wanted to believe it, but something in me rejected it outright. It didn't make sense. A guardian angel? Why would one just stand there like that? Why would it have a smile that felt more like a threat than anything comforting? It didn't sit right with me. It never did. I never saw her again, but the fear of that night never really left me. Even as I got older, I never completely shook it. I slept with my door shut tight after that. No more cracked doors, no more hallway light creeping in. I didn't want to risk seeing anything standing there again. Years later, I told a few people about it. Most just laughed it off. "Oh, you were a kid," they'd say. "Just a dream." But one time, a classmate listened, his expression going stiff, his face pale. Then he told me something that made my stomach drop all over again. One night, he had been outside, closing his garage door. And when he turned, he saw someone standing in his backyard. A teenage boy. The kid wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything, just standing there in the dark, smiling. And the smile. It was huge, way too big, stretching across his face in a way that wasn't right. My classmate didn't stop to think. He ran inside, locked the door, and didn't look back. I didn't know what to say. I didn't have an explanation, not for what I had seen, not for what he had seen. And even now, thinking about it, I don't have answers. All I know is that I never saw her again, and I don't want to. Ever. People can call it what they want. A dream. A trick of the light. A childhood imagination running wild. But to this day, I don't sleep with my door open. And I never, ever look into dark rooms if I don't have to. Because I'm afraid, deep down, no matter how much time passes, that one day, I'll see that awful smile again. It was around last year when everything happened. We had a friend, Kevin, who went missing for almost a week. I wouldn't say we were close. He lived in a campus dorm, and I barely saw him outside of group hangouts. I didn't even realize he was gone until the night we found out what happened to him. That night, my housemates were scrolling through the university's Facebook page when they came across a report. There had been a discovery of 2 bodies in the spring at the far edge of the campus. Our university is right next to a mountain, so there were a lot of places where people barely went. The spring wasn't exactly off limits, but no one really went there except for the occasional hikers or drunk students messing around. The post was vague at first, just stating that 2 bodies had been recovered from the water, but the way it was written made it clear that it was a pretty bad scene. We didn't think too much of it at first. Just another case of people getting into trouble. But then I heard one of my housemates whisper something, his voice tense. Wasn't Kevin missing? I hadn't even thought about it. I knew I hadn't seen Kevin in a while, but I didn't keep track of him. He had his own life, his own set of friends in the dorms. But my housemate, who was closer to him, confirmed it. He had been missing for several days. That's when the worry really set in. We all started scrambling for information, messaging friends, trying to figure out if he had been found. The more we looked, the worse the feeling in my gut got. Then the news came in. Initial identification of the bodies. The report had misspelled his last name, but we knew. It was him. I just remember staring at my phone, reading and rereading the report, hoping I had misunderstood something. The reality of it didn't sink in immediately. One moment he was just some guy I occasionally saw at parties or in the cafeteria, and the next he was gone. Not just gone, dead. And in the worst way possible. Panic set in. We left the house immediately and met up with some of his dorm mates. We all stood there in silence, a mix of shock and confusion on everyone's faces. Someone suggested going to the spring, and a few of our friends actually did. By the time they got there, the police had already taken the bodies away for autopsy. There was nothing to see except police tape and the faint outline of where people had stood, working under the dim light. No one knew what had really happened. The rumors started almost immediately. Some people thought it was a frat initiation gone wrong. The bodies, when they were pulled from the water, had strange marks on them. Deep, raw welts that looked almost like lashes. It didn't take long for people to speculate about hazing or some kind of twisted ritual. But then the truth came out. Kevin and the other guy, someone I didn't even know, had gone swimming there the weekend before. And they had drowned. It wasn't some dramatic story. There was no foul play, no hidden secrets. They had simply made a mistake. Maybe they had been drinking. Maybe the water was colder than they expected, their muscles locking up as they tried to swim. Maybe one of them panicked and dragged the other down with him. Whatever happened, no one was there to help them. They disappeared beneath the surface, and no one even knew they were there. The bodies had been in the water for days. By the time they were found, they were bloated, their skins stretched and discolored from being submerged for so long. Crustaceans had started eating away at their flesh. That was why they had looked like they were covered in lashes. Not some cruel act of violence, just nature doing what it does. I remember seeing a photo someone took before the police removed them. I wish I hadn't looked. I don't think I'll ever get that image out of my head. Their skin was pale and swollen, almost unrecognizable. The water had warped them, made them look less human. Kevin's face barely looked like his anymore. It was like something out of a horror movie, but this was real. This had actually happened to someone I knew. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept imagining what those final moments must have been like. The panic, the struggle, the realization that they weren't going to make it. Drowning isn't quick. It's slow, drawn out. And it must have been lonely. No one even knew they were there. Their bodies just drifted, hidden under the surface, while life continued on campus as usual. It made me realize how fragile everything is. 1 minute, you're just living your life, going about your routine, and the next you're gone. And sometimes, the world doesn't even notice right away. We only found out Kevin was missing because of that news report. If they hadn't found the bodies when they did, how long would it have taken for someone to realize he was gone? In the end, there was nothing we could do except attend the memorial service. It was small, quiet. His family came, some of his close friends spoke. I didn't say anything. I didn't feel like I had the right to. We weren't close after all. But I stood there and listened, and I thought about him, about how little I had really known him, and about how unfair it was that this was how his story ended. The university put up some new safety regulations after that. Signs warning students not to swim in the spring. Increased patrols in the area. But it didn't really change anything. People still do reckless things. People still make mistakes. And sometimes, those mistakes cost them everything. R.I.P. Kevin. When I was 13, my mom would pick me up from school, drop me off at home, and then leave to pick up my younger brother. It was our routine. She'd pull up in the driveway, I'd grab my backpack, head inside, and she'd be gone again within seconds. I was used to it. I'd come in, toss my bag somewhere near the door, and make a beeline for the computer. It was an old desktop, slow and bulky, but it was my main source of entertainment. I'd usually waste time on the internet until my mom and brother came back. That day was no different. I came in, shut the door behind me, kicked off my shoes, and headed straight for the computer. The house was quiet, like it always was when I was alone. It never really bothered me. We lived in a typical suburban neighborhood, one of those cookie-cutter developments where every house looked the same, and nothing bad ever seemed to happen. I was comfortable being alone. The silence didn't bother me. It was just how things were. I sat down at the desk, woke up the computer, and started browsing the internet. A couple of minutes passed before I heard it, the sound of running water. It was faint at first, just a light trickle, but then it got louder. It was coming from the kitchen. I figured my mom must have still been home, maybe rinsing something in the sink before leaving. It wasn't strange, so I ignored it. Then I heard the microwave door open and shut. Not fast, not slamming, just a normal opening and closing. That was a little odd. My mom wasn't the type to make something in the microwave right before leaving, but I still didn't think much of it. Maybe she forgot something. Maybe she was heating up a coffee she left on the counter. It wasn't like I had any reason to be scared. I kept browsing the internet, assuming she was still there. The water stopped. The house was quiet again. I figured she had finally left. A couple of minutes passed, and I heard the front door open. The sound of footsteps. My mom and brother were back. I turned around in my chair, smiling. Wow, that was fast. You just left. She gave me a confused look. What? I repeated myself, but her face didn't change. She told me she had been gone for a while, that she had left as soon as I came inside, just like she always did. That didn't make sense. I turned to look down the hallway toward the kitchen. Everything was still. The sink wasn't running. The microwave was closed. There was no sign that anything had been touched. But I knew what I had heard. I had been sitting there, not distracted, not wearing headphones. I had heard the water. I had heard the microwave. My stomach felt weird, like something heavy had settled inside it. I walked into the kitchen, checking the sink. It was dry. I checked the microwave. It was empty. Nothing had been used. It didn't look like anyone had been in there at all. I stood there for a long moment, listening, waiting to hear anything else, but the house was dead silent. The air felt thick, different somehow. My hands felt a little shaky, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had zoned out and let my mind play tricks on me. But I knew that wasn't true. I had heard those sounds as clearly as I was hearing my own breathing. Something had made them. I tried to move past it, but the feeling stayed with me for the rest of the evening. The house felt different. I kept glancing toward the kitchen, half expecting to see something out of place. I double-checked the locks before bed, something I never usually did. I lay there in the dark, eyes wide open, listening to the silence, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I never figured out what caused those noises. It never happened again. But for weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been in the house with me that day. And the scariest part was that I hadn't even realized it at the time. I remember the way my uncle used to look at my mom, back before he got sick. He always had a kind of light in his eyes when they talked, an easy laughter between them that made it clear they had years of memories holding them together. He was her older brother, and though they bickered sometimes like all siblings do, there was never any real malice. Just family, just love, hidden beneath a lifetime of teasing. That changed when the cancer came. The tumors didn't just take his strength, they took his mind piece by piece, until there was barely anything left of the man he used to be. The dementia set in fast, twisting everything. One moment, he'd be fine, sharp as ever, and the next, he was accusing my mom of stealing from him, calling her stupid for not arranging his papers the way he wanted. And not just little insults, real, cutting ones, the kind that left her quiet for hours afterward. I was still a kid then, not even a teenager, but I saw the way it hurt her. I hated it. I hated how she'd bite her tongue, how she'd force herself to stay calm when he snapped. Sometimes, she'd come home and sit in silence for a long time before making dinner, her eyes looking distant, like she was somewhere else. And in a way, I think she was thinking about the brother she had before, the one who'd take her out for ice cream when they were kids, the one who made her laugh so hard she cried. Not this stranger who looked like him, but had none of the warmth left. And I hated how he made me feel, too. The unpredictability of it all, how I never knew what would set him off. One visit, he'd ask me about school, and the next, he'd glare at me like I was some intruder in his home. Sometimes, he'd be normal for a while, and I'd almost let myself believe he was still in there. But then it would happen again. The yelling, the accusations, the anger over something that made no sense. I started to dread going over there, but my mom never had a choice. He needed her, even if he never said it. When he finally passed, it was a strange mix of emotions. Grief, of course, he had been part of our lives for so long, but also relief. Not just for my mom, but for him. The suffering was over. His mind and body were no longer betraying him. We went through the funeral, the condolences, the sorting of his things. And then life just moved on. It had to. A year passed. I hadn't thought about him much, not in a long time. My mom and I had settled back into our routines, and though she still got quiet sometimes when she saw an old photo of them together, things felt normal again. And then one night, we came home to find the answering machine blinking. One of those old tape ones, the kind with little cassettes that clicked when you played them. I barely noticed it. I was already kicking off my shoes, heading for the kitchen, but my mom pressed the button as she sorted through the mail. The first message played, and it was his voice. I froze. My mom did too. For a second, my mind scrambled for an explanation. It had to be an old message. Maybe something we just never erased. The message itself wasn't anything special, just him asking about something. Something we had heard before. A tiny chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off. Just a machine. Just an old tape. But then the second message played. And this one we hadn't heard before. It was him. His voice, weaker than I remembered, but still his. And he was apologizing. I shouldn't have said that earlier. That was all. That was it. The machine clicked, and then silence. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I let it out. My mom wasn't moving. She was just staring at the machine, her face completely unreadable. It didn't make sense. We hadn't been to his house in a year. He'd been dead for a year. But there was his voice, caught in that tiny tape, telling her something he'd never had the chance to say when he was alive. And he meant it. I could hear it in his tone. That brief moment of clarity, the real him pushing through the sickness, through the confusion, long enough to feel regret. But how did it happen? We sat there for a long time, trying to rationalize it. Maybe the tape had jammed. Maybe it had only just now played back something from a year ago. Maybe there was some logical explanation we were missing. But none of it felt right. It wasn't just the message. It was the timing. A whole year had passed, and only now did we hear it? And why this message, of all things? I looked at my mom, expecting her to be scared, to throw the whole machine out, to wipe the tape clean. But she didn't. Instead, she reached out, pressed the button again, and listened to it one more time. And then she smiled just a little. Not because she understood it. Not because it made sense. But because, maybe, just maybe, it was the thing she had needed to hear all along. We were living with my grandparents at the time. My aunt's room was at the end of the hallway, past my grandparents' bedroom and across from the small guest bathroom. I never liked going in there. Something about it always felt off, even though it was just a normal bedroom, a bed, a dresser, some old books on a shelf. But the one thing that made the room unbearable was the doll. It stood 2 feet tall, perched on the nightstand beside my aunt's bed, facing the door as if it were waiting for whoever entered. It had the pale, porcelain face of a Victorian child, with painted blue eyes that seemed too lifelike, too aware. Its dress was made of dusty, faded pink lace, and its stiff plastic fingers were curled unnaturally, locked into the mechanism that turned it into a lamp. That was the worst part. The doll wasn't just a decoration, it functioned. To turn it on, you had to take its cold, lifeless hand and lift its arm. A soft, yellowish glow would fill the room, flickering slightly as if the bulb inside was unsure it wanted to be there. I avoided that room as much as I could, but that day, I had no choice. I was home alone. My mom and grandparents had gone out for the afternoon, leaving me with an empty house and an afternoon stretched out before me. It was summer, hot and dry, and all I wanted was a blanket to curl up under while I watched TV. I knew my aunt kept extra blankets in her closet, and I also knew the closet was just a few steps inside the room. If I was quick, I could be in and out without ever looking up. I stood in the doorway for a second, taking in the room. The sunlight streaming through the window made everything look normal, harmless. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a doll, just a lamp, just a room. Keeping my eyes on the floor, I stepped inside and turned sharply to my right. The closet was there, just as I remembered, its wooden door slightly ajar. I reached in and felt for the familiar softness of a folded blanket. My fingers brushed against fabric, and I grabbed it, ready to turn and bolt back to the safety of the hallway. But something was wrong. The room was different, brighter. The doll lamp was on. I could feel the change before I saw it. The shift in shadows, the way the closet door cast a deeper contrast against the light. The realization crept up my spine, cold and slow, until the hair on my arms stood up and my breath caught in my throat. I hadn't touched the doll. I knew that. I hadn't been anywhere near the nightstand. I had kept my head down, my focus on the closet, and yet the room had changed behind me. My body locked in place. The blanket in my hand suddenly felt too heavy, my fingers too stiff to release it. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to get out, to never set foot in that room again. But before I could do any of that, I had to look. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I would see. My stomach twisted in knots as my gaze traveled up from the floor, past the bed, and finally, to the nightstand. The doll's hand was raised. It was pointing directly at me. My mouth went dry. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs, deafening in the silence of the room. The doll's unblinking eyes locked onto mine, its frozen smile twisting into something unnatural, something knowing. The warm glow of the lamp made its porcelain face look almost alive, almost like it was watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare, my brain desperately trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe the mechanism was loose. Maybe a draft had moved the arm. Maybe. No, I had been in the room for less than a minute. Nothing had touched the doll. Nothing had moved. And yet here I was, standing in its eerie glow, its hand raised as if it had done it on its own. The spell broke all at once. My survival instincts finally took over. I lurched backward, slamming the closet door shut in my panic. The sound echoed through the house as I bolted for the hallway, my legs moving before my mind could even catch up. I tore down the hall, through the living room, and straight out the front door. Only when I was outside, standing in the scorching summer heat, did I finally allow myself to breathe. I waited on the porch, heart hammering, blanket still clutched in my hands. Every few seconds, I glanced back at the house, half expecting to see the doll standing in the doorway, watching me. The minutes dragged on, but nothing happened. The house remained silent, unchanged. But I knew what I had seen. I knew that when I had entered that room, the lamp had been off. I knew that when I had turned around, the hand had been raised. And I knew that I hadn't touched it. That night, I refused to sleep in my room. I made up some excuse and slept on the couch instead, keeping my back pressed against the cushions, facing the hallway so I could see if anyone, came out of my aunt's room. The next day, when my family came home, I told them what had happened. My mom laughed it off, said the lamp had always been weird, that maybe the old wiring had shorted out. My grandmother brushed it away, saying it was probably just my imagination. My aunt, on the other hand, barely reacted. She simply nodded and said, "Yeah, that thing's always been creepy." I never set foot in that room again. A few years later, my aunt moved out, taking most of her things with her. But the doll she left behind. My grandmother eventually got rid of it, though she never said how. One day it was just gone, the nightstand empty, the room suddenly feeling a little less heavy. But even now, years later, I can still see it. The way its tiny hand reached toward me. The way its cold plastic fingers curled into position. The way the light flickered when it shouldn't have. And every once in a while, when I find myself in a dark room, I swear I can feel something watching me. Waiting, just like it did that day. I used to work as a cleaner at my school after class, so I always left late when the roads were already quiet. Most students had already walked home by the time I finished, and the only people still around were a few teachers heading to their cars or the janitor locking up. The streets always felt a little eerie that late in the afternoon, especially in winter when it got dark early. The school was in a suburban area, and my walk home wasn't very long, but I had to pass through a few empty streets before reaching my neighborhood. It was usually peaceful, just the occasional car driving past, the distant sound of dogs barking from backyards, or the rustling of trees in the wind. One evening, as I was walking home, I noticed someone behind me. He wasn't too close, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, but there was something off about him. He walked at a steady pace, not fast enough to catch up to me, but not slow enough to lose sight of me. It wasn't unusual to see other people walking home, but something about this man made my skin crawl. His face looked unnatural, like it was too smooth, almost plasticky, and he had this subtle smile that never changed. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just a neighbor, someone who lived nearby and happened to be walking in the same direction. I pushed the thought out of my mind and kept walking, keeping my pace steady. I didn't see him again for a while, so I forgot about it. But 2 weeks later, there he was. Same man, same distance behind me, same steady pace, same unsettling smile. This time, I felt my stomach twist in a way it hadn't before. It wasn't a coincidence. He was following me. But even then, I didn't tell anyone. I was 16, and I knew exactly how my parents would react. They'd want to start picking me up from school, maybe even talking to the school about it. That would mean getting the teachers involved, maybe even the police. It sounded like a nightmare. I didn't want to deal with that kind of attention, so I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. After that, I saw him every single day. Always behind me, always the same distance away, never speeding up or slowing down. I started changing my route, taking different streets, even going through a small park just to see if he'd still be there. He always was. No matter what route I took, I'd glance back at some point, and there he'd be, walking behind me with that same unreadable expression. The weirdest part was that he never did anything. He never got closer, never spoke, never made a move to chase me. He just followed. It made it even worse because it meant I had no real reason to tell anyone. If I said anything, they'd just tell me to ignore him. And technically, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just walking. It all escalated on a Saturday. I was walking to my friend's house, which wasn't far from school, so the route was almost the same as my usual walk home. I wasn't thinking about him, wasn't expecting to see him because it was the weekend and I wasn't coming from school. But as I turned onto the main road, I saw a minibus parked at the bottom of the hill. Something about it caught my attention. The windows were tinted, but not dark enough to completely hide what was inside. My stomach dropped when I saw him sitting in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead, right at me. He wasn't walking this time. He was waiting. I immediately pulled out my phone and called my friend. I didn't want to say anything out loud, but I made it obvious I was on a call, speaking loud enough that anyone nearby would hear. I hoped that would deter him. I kept walking, trying not to look directly at him, but my skin was crawling. When I glanced back again, he wasn't in the minibus anymore. Panic set in, and I started walking faster, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to run because I knew that might make things worse, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder. He was there. He had closed the distance, and now he was only 2 meters behind me. That same expression, that same slight, unnatural smile. But this time, he was moving faster, keeping my pace exactly. My breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. I could hear the sound of his footsteps matching mine, not too fast, not too slow. I told my friend to open her front door and wait for me. I didn't say why, but she could probably hear the fear in my voice. The second her house was in sight, I ran. I sprinted up the driveway and bolted inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My friend looked confused at first, but then I gestured toward the window, and we both saw him. He was standing outside, right at the edge of the driveway, staring in through the window. He didn't move. He didn't knock or try to get in. He just stood there, smiling. We watched him for 2 hours. He never left. He didn't shift his weight, didn't check his phone, didn't look around. He just stared. At one point, we thought about calling the police, but I kept hesitating. What would I even say? That a man had been following me home for weeks, but had never actually done anything? That he was standing outside, but not trespassing? It felt pointless. I was terrified, but at the same time, I felt like I was overreacting. Eventually, as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away. I stayed at my friend's house that night, too scared to go home alone. The next morning, I expected to see him waiting somewhere on my way home, but he wasn't there. And after that night, I never saw him again. Years passed. I moved away for college and didn't return home much. But last weekend, I visited my parents for the first time in a long while. It was strange being back, walking those same streets. I had almost forgotten about him, convinced myself that I had imagined parts of it, that I had let my teenage fears blow it out of proportion. But as I passed the bottom of that same hill, my breath caught in my throat. The minibus was still there, parked in the exact same spot. I don't know if he's still around. I don't know if he ever really left, but I didn't stick around to find out. The fare was always the same. Bright lights, loud music, the smell of fried food mixing with the crisp night air. It was the highlight of the summer, the one thing we all looked forward to before school started again. That year, it was no different. My friends and I had spent the whole evening wandering through the stalls, eating too much cotton candy, and riding the same rides we always did. But after a while, the crowd started to feel suffocating. The noise was too much, the lights too bright. We wanted a break. Just beyond the fairgrounds was a long walking trail. It wound through the park and stretched on for miles. It was mostly used during the day by joggers and families, but at night, it was quiet, empty. It seemed like the perfect place to get away from the chaos for a little while. So we left the main fairgrounds behind and headed down the path, laughing and talking as we walked. The deeper we went, the darker it got. The lights from the fair didn't reach this far, and the few streetlights that lined the trail were too far apart to make a difference. The only real light came from the moon, filtering through the trees. It wasn't enough to see much, just enough to make out shapes and shadows. We didn't mind, though. It was nice to be away from the noise. After walking for a while, we came across a tunnel at the top of a small hill. It was old, covered in graffiti, with the kind of damp smell that made it clear no one had bothered to clean it in years. We sat down near the entrance, enjoying the cool air that drifted out from inside. It felt good after the heat of the fair. We were sitting there, talking about nothing in particular, when I noticed her. A woman, pushing a stroller, making her way up the hill toward us. I remember thinking how out of place she looked. The fair was still in full swing, and this trail wasn't the kind of place people brought babies at night. But she didn't seem worried. She walked with purpose, like she knew exactly where she was going. When she reached us, she stopped. She didn't seem nervous or scared, just concerned. She asked if we knew the man standing at the bottom of the hill. I hadn't noticed him before, but when I looked, he was right there. A little off to the side, near a bench, standing just close enough to be visible, but far enough that we couldn't see his face clearly. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't smoking, or looking at his phone, or stretching like someone who had been sitting too long. He was just standing there, looking in our direction. We told her we didn't know him, and she hesitated for just a second before nodding. She told us he had been following us for a while, that she had seen him moving when we moved, stopping when we stopped, that she didn't know what he wanted, but that we should be careful. The air changed after that. The night didn't feel fun anymore. It felt dangerous. The tunnel behind us suddenly seemed like a trap, the trees around us too dense. There was only one way down the hill, and he was standing right there. None of us spoke. We just stood up, turned, and started walking back toward the fairgrounds. Not running. Running would make it worse. Running would make him chase us. At least, that's what it felt like. I don't know if he moved. I didn't look back. I just walked as fast as I could without making it obvious that I was trying to get away. The closer we got to the fair, the safer it felt. The noise, the lights, the people, suddenly, all of it was comforting. By the time we reached the crowd again, my heart was pounding. I don't know what happened to him. Maybe he was just some guy sitting on a bench, and the woman had misunderstood. Maybe he wasn't following us at all. But maybe he was. Maybe he was waiting for us to go deeper down the trail, to be completely alone. Maybe he was planning something. We stayed in the fairgrounds for the rest of the night, sticking to the crowded areas, never straying too far from the lights. None of us said much about it, but I knew we were all thinking the same thing. If that woman hadn't warned us, if we hadn't left when we did, what would have happened? I still don't know, and I don't want to. It was late 2002 or early 2003 when I lived on an isolated road that stretched out into nowhere. A narrow strip of asphalt with no side streets, no houses past the first few miles, and no streetlights. Just darkness, trees, and the occasional sign riddled with bullet holes. The road had a reputation. People loved to race down it, taking the curves too fast, testing their luck. It was common to hear the distant, hollow sound of a crash in the night. That night, I was home with my ex. It was quiet outside, the kind of silence you get only in places far from everything. Then, the sound of screeching tires cut through the stillness, followed by the familiar, gut-dropping crash of metal against metal. But something about this one was different. It didn't sound like a single impact. It sounded like multiple crashes, one after another, like something tumbling violently down the road. We grabbed our shoes and ran out. The night air was thick and still, except for the distant hum of an engine revving. That wasn't normal. When we reached the road, debris was everywhere, glass, twisted metal, and things I couldn't immediately identify. A pickup truck had taken a turn too hard and flipped. It had thrown all three of its passengers. The multiple crashes we heard were the truck slamming into the ground over and over as it rolled. The engine was still running. Smoke poured from under the hood, thick and white, curling upward like it was on fire. The truck was mangled, the front completely caved in, the roof crushed. There was no movement inside. Then I saw him. A man sat in the middle of the road, making a noise I'll never forget. It wasn't screaming, not exactly. It was a deep, ragged, guttural sound, somewhere between a sob and an animal's cry. He wasn't moving much, just hunched there, his arms limp at his sides. His friend lay nearby. I couldn't see him clearly in the dark, but I knew. He wasn't moving. The air was thick with the smell of oil, burnt rubber, and something else. Something coppery and wrong. Sirens cut through the night. The cops showed up fast, their lights flashing red and blue against the trees. When they turned on the spotlights, the whole scene lit up at once, and that's when everything became worse. The road was a mess. Pieces of the truck were everywhere. Pieces of people were everywhere. I knew the moment those lights came on, but my mind refused to process it. Even now, I can't recall a single clear image from that moment. It's like my brain shut it out. But I know. I know what I saw, or what I must have seen. Cops walked around with body bags. Not for the men who were still there. They'd been taken away long before. The bags were for what had been left behind. My neighbor told me later that I had calmly stepped over remains when the lights came on, that there had been something next to me, and I had just stepped over it like it was nothing. But I don't remember that. I don't remember much after the lights came on. I know I stood there, watching. I know I saw the helicopter circling low, its rotor wash shaking the trees. The downdraft was strong enough to send leaves and loose dirt whipping through the air. I remember standing there, feeling the wind against my skin, watching that helicopter make wide, slow circles over the road. That's all I remember. Out of the 3 men, 2 died right there on the pavement. The 3rd survived. He was the one making that sound in the road, the one I saw sitting there in the dark. He disappeared after that. They were migrant workers. No family here. No ties. He fled the country. For days after, the bloodstains remained. Even after the rain, even after cars passed over it, the stains lingered on the asphalt, in the pull-off in front of my driveway. It was there every time I left the house. A reminder. I never heard another crash the same way again. I never ran out to check. That road kept claiming people, and I let it. I don't know why the feeling hit me so hard, but it did. It crept up slow at first. Just a nagging worry in the back of my mind when my fiancé got the call for another job in Pennsylvania. We'd been living in Texas, moving around a lot because of his work, but before heading out to PA, we decided to take a trip back home to California to see our families. It made sense. We didn't know when we'd have another chance, and we always tried to see them whenever we could. But this time, something felt different. I couldn't put it into words, not really. Just a heaviness in my chest, a tight, anxious feeling that wouldn't go away. I started getting irritable, and we ended up arguing about the trip. I felt ridiculous, even while we were fighting. Why was I so upset? There was no reason for it. We'd done this before, gone home for a little while, visited our families, then left again for his next job. It wasn't new, but something inside me was screaming that this time wasn't the same. His family lived about 6 hours from mine, so we planned to stop at his parents' house for a night before I took off with our son to my parents' place the next morning. I was still on edge, my emotions completely out of control, and I broke down crying before I left. It didn't make sense. I wasn't the type to cry over little things, but there I was, sobbing like my heart was breaking for no reason I could explain. He held me, confused but gentle, rubbing my back and trying to reassure me. "It's not like I'm going away," he told me. "I'll see you in less than a week." I nodded, trying to shake off the awful feeling, but it clung to me like something pressing down on my chest. He kissed me goodbye, and I got in the car with our son, driving the long stretch of highway to my parents' house. Being home should have felt comforting, but I couldn't shake the unease. I went through the motions, talking with my family, playing with my son, trying to enjoy the visit, but something wasn't right. I kept checking my phone, expecting bad news, even though there was no reason to think anything was wrong. 2 days later, I talked to him on the phone late in the evening. His voice sounded tired, drained in a way that made my stomach twist. I asked if he was okay, and he just said he was exhausted. I told him to get some sleep. That night, I fell asleep quickly, but something pulled me awake, except I wasn't really awake. It was like I had slipped into some in-between place, heavy and cold and suffocating. The darkness around me wasn't just the normal kind you get when you close your eyes. It was deep, endless, thick like it had weight. I couldn't move. I couldn't see. It was like everything inside me had been drained, like I was completely, utterly alone in a way I had never felt before. I remember feeling cold. Not the kind of cold you get when a blanket slips off in the night, but a cold that settled inside my bones, inside my chest. A sorrow so deep I felt like I was being swallowed by it. My breath caught in my throat, my body frozen, and the feeling got stronger, until it was too much. I gasped awake, heart pounding, my skin clammy. The room was quiet, nothing out of place, but I was shaking. I pulled the blanket around me and sat up, trying to catch my breath, trying to shake the awful feeling off me. I had never experienced anything like that before. It wasn't a nightmare. It was something else. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I grabbed my phone and called him. No answer. I called again, and again. No response. My stomach was in knots, but I told myself he was just busy, maybe still asleep. Hours passed, and I kept trying, my worry growing with every unanswered call. By the time evening rolled around, I knew something was wrong. Then, around 6 p.m., my phone rang. I don't remember the exact words. Just the sound of someone's voice, serious, careful, and the moment the words registered, the world tilted under me. He was gone, passed away in his sleep. Heart problems, they said. Nothing anyone saw coming, nothing that gave a warning. Just gone. I don't remember the rest of that night clearly. I remember dropping my phone, my hands shaking so bad I couldn't hold on to it. I remember the way my own breath sounded too loud in my ears, the way my vision blurred. I remember someone talking to me, my parents, maybe, but I couldn't process the words. What I do remember, clear as anything, is that feeling from the night before. The cold, the sorrow, the blackness wrapping around me like a presence I couldn't escape. I know now what it was. I felt him leave me. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in spirits or the idea that people linger after death. But I believe in what I felt. I know deep down in my bones that I felt him go. It was the loneliest, emptiest feeling I've ever known, and no matter how much time passes, I can never shake it. I miss him every single day. I have been wanting to share this story for a long time. It still gives me chills when I think about it, and even now, it affects my life every single day. Back when I was 19, I met a girl, and we started a relationship. We had 2 beautiful daughters together, but like many young couples, we struggled with money. She was of native background, but had moved off the reserve to live with me in the city. We tried to make things work, scraping by with what little we had. By 2005, we were renting a small house, trying to build a stable life for our kids. Her youngest brother, Clinton, came to stay with us for a couple of weeks. He was just 16, a good kid, quiet but kind. It was nice having him around, and my daughters loved their uncle. He would play with them, tell them stories, and help out whenever he could. Things seemed normal, and there was nothing unusual about him being there, until one night. I woke up in the middle of the night to strange sounds coming from the living room where Clinton was sleeping. It was an eerie, deep howling, something so unnatural that it sent a chill through me. I got out of bed and walked to the living room. Clinton was still asleep, but he was sitting up, his head tilted back, making this awful, primitive sound. It wasn't human. It sounded like a wolf calling out in the night. The hairs on my arms stood up. I had never heard anything like it before. I shook him lightly, and suddenly he stopped. He fell back onto the couch, as if nothing had happened. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process what I had just witnessed. Eventually, I went back to bed, telling myself it must have been some kind of strange dream. But it stayed with me. Something about it felt too real. A couple of days later, Clinton surprised us all by inviting us out to dinner. He took us to the Keg, which was expensive for a 16-year-old to be paying for. I found it odd, but at the same time, I thought maybe he was just being generous, wanting to do something nice for us. We enjoyed the meal, and Clinton seemed happy. That was the last time we ever saw him. The next morning, Clinton was gone. My girlfriend assumed he had gone back to the reserve early. But then we got the call. Clinton had been killed in a car accident on the way back. He was gone just like that. Our hearts sank. My girlfriend was devastated, completely shattered by the news. I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The way he had howled in his sleep. The way he had taken us out to dinner like it was some kind of farewell. I couldn't shake the feeling that, in some way, he had known. At his funeral, my girlfriend's older brother, Joe, was a mess. He broke down completely, sobbing, clinging to the tombstone, refusing to leave. I had never seen a grown man that broken. It was hard to watch, knowing there was nothing I could do to take away that pain. That night, the family gathered around a fire to honor Clinton's spirit. We sat together, sharing stories about him, remembering the good times. As I sat there, staring into the flames, something caught my eye. A single black crow was circling above us. I looked around the sky. It was empty except for that one bird. It kept flying in slow, deliberate circles over the fire, never straying. A strange feeling settled over me, something I couldn't explain. It was like the air had shifted, like something unseen was there with us. A month passed, and just as the weight of Clinton's loss was starting to settle in, we got another call. Joe had been killed in a car accident, the same way Clinton had. It felt like a cruel joke, like some horrible curse had been set upon this family. My girlfriend collapsed in grief, unable to believe that she had lost both of her brothers in the span of a few weeks. And at Joe's funeral, the same thing happened. As my girlfriend mourned, she found herself clinging to his tombstone the same way Joe had clung to Clinton's. And that night, when the family gathered for the fire, I looked up into the sky. This time, there were 2 black crows circling above us. I scanned the horizon, searching for any other birds, but there were none, only those 2, watching from above. 2 months later, my girlfriend woke up in a panic. She had a dream that our house burned down, and we all died in the fire. She was already superstitious and truly believed that something dark was surrounding us. She packed up the kids and went to stay with a friend for a couple of nights, just to clear her head. While she was gone, I ran into an old high school friend, Tim. We loved music and decided to have a jam session at my place. We played late into the night, and when Tim left, I passed out on the couch, exhausted. The next morning, I woke up and went to work like any normal day. But about an hour later, I got a call. My house was on fire. I rushed back to find my home reduced to ashes. Police tape surrounded the area, and firefighters were still working to control the last of the smoldering remains. The house was completely gone. If my girlfriend and kids had been inside, they wouldn't have made it out. I stood there, staring at the ruins, unable to process what had happened. The dream she had, it had come true. Shortly after, our relationship fell apart. She moved back to the reserve, and I got full custody of our daughters. Life moved on, but the heaviness of that year never really left. I eventually remarried, and my daughters lived with me, visiting their mother on weekends. But then came the worst call of all. It was Christmas 2007 when my ex called, asking to take the girls for the holiday break. I could hear something in her voice, something fragile, something I had never heard before. An hour later, her sister called me sobbing. She had been killed in a car crash on her way home from work. She wasn't wearing her seatbelt and was the only one who died in the accident. The next day, I had to tell my daughters that their mother was gone. It was the hardest thing I had ever done in my life. They were so young, too young to fully understand what had happened, but old enough to feel the loss in ways I couldn't protect them from. At her funeral, as I was leaving the reserve, a feeling washed over me. I knew what I was about to see before I even looked up. I lifted my eyes to the sky, and there they were, 3 black crows, circling above us. I didn't question it. I just knew. Time passed, and life went on, but the strange occurrences never stopped. One night, I was talking with my new wife about the trial of the drunk driver who had killed my ex. I was expressing my frustration about the way the case was being handled when my wife made an offhand comment, dismissing my ex as a terrible person. The next morning, when I stepped outside to leave for work, I froze. My car was covered in bird shit. Not just a little, a full-on assault, as if 50 birds had chosen my car as their personal target. None of the other cars in the area had been touched. I stood there, staring at it, knowing without a doubt that it was her. She had heard. She had sent a message. I will never look at black birds the same way again. They mean something now. They always will. It was late fall, and the air had that sharp bite to it, the kind that makes your breath visible when you exhale. I was in 7th grade, staying over at my best friend's house for the weekend. He lived outside of town, in one of those rural areas where houses were spread far apart, and the roads were mostly empty once the sun went down. His place sat up on a hill with a long gravel driveway leading down to the road, surrounded by thick patches of trees on either side. The nearest neighbors were far enough away that you wouldn't hear a scream if someone needed help. That wasn't something I thought about back then, but I do now. We had decided earlier in the day that we were going to go out that night and wrap some houses with toilet paper. That was the plan. It wasn't my idea, but I went along with it because at that age, you don't want to be the one saying no. It was just supposed to be harmless fun. His parents had told us we weren't allowed to leave the house, but my friend had a habit of doing whatever he wanted, and I wasn't going to argue with him. We waited until they went to bed and then snuck out around 1 a.m., slipping out the back door as quietly as possible, a big black trash bag stuffed full of toilet paper in hand. The night was dark, no streetlights, no porch lights from nearby houses, just the faint glow of the moon barely visible behind thin, wispy clouds. We moved fast down the gravel driveway, trying not to make too much noise. Every crunch of the loose stones under our feet sounded impossibly loud. When we finally reached the road, we were feeling good, ready to get started. But just as soon as our shoes hit the pavement, my friend suddenly froze. "Car," he whispered. I didn't hear it at first, but then I saw the faint glow of headlights down the road. Without thinking, we both jumped into the ditch that ran alongside it, lying flat in the damp grass. A few seconds later, a car sped past, moving fast, not slowing down. We stayed down, waiting for the sound of the engine to fade before getting back up. But before we could take another step, my friend grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard. "Shit," he muttered. "It's coming back." I turned and looked. Way down the road, I could see the red glow of taillights, brake lights burning in the darkness. Then slowly, they disappeared as the car made a slow, deliberate U-turn. I didn't understand. Why would a car that had been driving so fast suddenly turn around? We were wearing dark clothes, and it was pitch black out. No one should have seen us. We dove back down into the ditch, pressing ourselves flat against the ground, barely daring to breathe. The car came back, moving much slower this time. It was on the opposite side of the road now, creeping forward, like whoever was inside was looking for something. Looking for us. It passed again, and we waited. I felt my friend tense up beside me, lifting his head slightly to peek over the edge of the ditch. "Dude," he whispered, barely audible. "It's coming again." My stomach turned to ice. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew it wasn't normal. A cop would have stopped already. A regular person would have kept going. This car wasn't doing either of those things. There was a culvert a few feet away, a large metal pipe running under the road for drainage. It was the only real cover we had, so I started to crawl toward it, keeping low, trying to move as quietly as possible. My friend grabbed my shirt, yanking me back. "Stay down," he hissed. The car rolled by again, even slower this time. Then, to my absolute horror, it stopped. Right over us. I could hear the low rumble of the engine, feel the vibrations through the ground. We lay there, completely motionless, hearts pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it inside the car. The seconds stretched on forever. I could smell the damp earth beneath me, the faint scent of gasoline in the air. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, struggling to stay quiet. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car moved again. It rolled forward, creeping away, its tires crunching softly against the pavement. But it wasn't over. The car circled back again, and again. Each time, it moved a little slower, stopped a little longer. It was toying with us. Whoever was inside knew we were there. The last time it passed, we didn't wait. As soon as it was far enough down the road, we jumped up, ditched the trash bag, and ran. We sprinted full speed back up the driveway, not stopping until we were inside the house, slamming the door behind us. We locked everything, deadbolts, windows, even the garage. We turned off all the lights, not wanting to be seen. Then we grabbed whatever we could find as weapons, plastic bats, hockey sticks, anything. And we watched. A few minutes later, we saw it. Through the window, parked at the end of the driveway, its headlights off, just sitting there, waiting. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We just stood there, staring, gripping our makeshift weapons with sweaty hands. The car stayed there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then finally, it started moving again. It backed up, slowly, then turned around and drove off, disappearing into the darkness. We didn't sleep that night. We sat in the living room, every light off, every sound making us jump. Every time a car passed outside, we held our breath, waiting to see if it would stop. It never did, but we weren't convinced it was over. Even as the sun started to rise, we stayed on edge, watching. In the morning, we told my friend's parents what had happened. His dad listened, but he didn't say much, just nodded and went out to check the driveway. He found tire tracks at the entrance, deep ruts in the dirt where the car had been sitting. But that was it. No sign of who it was or why they had been there. We never found out who was in that car. We never found out what they wanted. But to this day, I still think about it. The way it circled back. The way it stopped right over us. The way it just sat there at the end of the driveway, waiting. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't run. I don't want to know. And I will never forget that night. Last year, a good friend of mine died. I'll call him Charlie. His death was unexpected. He had taken some shrapnel to the leg in Iraq, but had pulled through. That wasn't what got him. It was something else, something personal, and I won't get into that. But his death hit hard, especially for another friend of mine, Bill. Bill was the best friend I had in the Army. The kind of guy everyone wanted to be around. He had confidence without arrogance. He cared about people, and he knew what mattered and what didn't. You meet people like him maybe once or twice in your life if you're lucky. And when Charlie died, it tore him up inside. A week after Charlie's death, his family flew out to a nearby town, and we decided to have a small memorial for him. It wasn't anything official, just some of us getting together to share stories, drink, and remember him. I wasn't 21 yet, so I was the designated driver, which meant I got to watch everyone else get hammered while I stayed sober. Bill was drinking hard that night. He was throwing back shots, draining pitchers, taking whatever anyone handed him. At first, he was his usual self, laughing, telling stories, making people feel comfortable. But as the night went on, his mood changed. He got quieter, more serious. It was around 1 a.m. when he came up to me and said, "Come outside with me while I smoke." I followed him out. The night air was cool, and the parking lot was mostly empty. Bill sat down on a concrete block, cigarette dangling from his fingers, staring at the ground. I stood next to him, waiting for him to say something. When he finally spoke, it was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard. "After I go home tonight, I'm going to kill myself." Everything in me locked up. My heart started pounding. My hands started shaking. My brain didn't want to accept what I had just heard. But I had to. I had to do something. I tried talking to him, telling him he didn't mean that he was just drunk, that he needed to go home, sleep it off. But he just shook his head. He started talking about how much he hated himself, how he didn't deserve to be here, how he should have been the one who died instead of Charlie. I couldn't let him talk like that. I started yelling at him. I told him to shut the hell up. I told him he had people who cared about him, that he wasn't allowed to do this, that I wasn't going to let him. I don't even remember half the things I said, but I remember how scared I was. It wasn't like being afraid for your own life. That kind of fear is different. This was worse. This was knowing that if I didn't say the right thing, do the right thing, I might lose him. At some point, I hit him. I didn't even think about it. I just did it. I hit him hard, right in the face. He barely reacted, just looked at me like he didn't care. But then something shifted. His shoulders slumped. He covered his face with his hands and just started shaking. My squad leader came outside right then, probably to check on us, and I turned to him and told him to fuck off. The only time in my life I've ever said that to him. I couldn't let anyone interrupt. I couldn't let Bill shut down. I needed to keep him talking. A couple of other friends came out a little while later. I don't even remember who exactly. They saw what was happening, and they helped. They talked to him. They listened. They sat with him. It took time, but eventually, he wasn't just staring at the ground anymore. He wasn't talking about ending it. He was just quiet, tired. That was when I decided I was done taking chances. I got him in my car and drove him back to the barracks. The whole way there, I kept checking to make sure he wasn't doing anything, that he wasn't trying to reach for anything, that he was still awake. My hands were sweating, my heart still racing. I didn't trust the silence. When we got back to the barracks, I walked him up to his room. I opened his closet, shoved him inside, and closed the door. Then I sat down against it. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I just sat there, making sure he stayed put, making sure he didn't try to leave, making sure he made it through the night. The next morning, I heard him moving around. Then his voice, confused and groggy. "Why the hell am I in the closet?" I opened the door and told him everything. I told him what he had said, what had happened, what I had done. He just sat there, rubbing his head, taking it all in. Then he looked at me and said, "I'm not drinking for a long fucking time." And he didn't. That was the scariest night of my life. Not because I was in danger, but because he was. Because I could have lost him. Because I wasn't sure if I had done enough, if I had said enough, if I had been strong enough to stop him. I learned something that night. When you really care about someone, when their life is in your hands, there's nothing scarier. It's not your own life you fear losing the most. It's theirs.